This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream and Nebula. You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. Or more actually, people find out that you've been a giant douche nozzle the entire time. We're not even done with the first 2 months of 2022, and we're already dealing with way too much stuff already this year. I mean, that Microsoft Activision Blizzard acquisition? Yay, industry consolidation! And the death of Betty White was honestly heartbreaking, and I'm not even sure what to make of the fact that Daniel Radcliffe is playing Weird Al. Didn't know I wanted it, but I'm here for it. It's been a strange, surreal year already. I mean, next you're gonna tell me that one of the actors on Lost outed themselves as problematic or something. What? Oh, what the f- But sadly, one thing that didn't change when I switched from my Beards of Star Trek 2021 calendar to the 2022 version featuring Carol Marcus as Kirk's beard is the fact that many of us, especially us in the nerd space, are still wrestling with creators of works that we loved, works that in many cases informed, shaped, and inspired us in innumerable ways, who turn out to hold harmful views, or, more often, to have perpetuated harmful actions. Or both. While I'm sure each of you thought of a specific person when I said that, probably the most immediate example in many of our minds this year is nerd cultural icon Joss Whedon. Just a few years ago, Whedon was considered to be not only one of the most influential figures in Hollywood, but also one of the few that was truly celebrated as a human being. And I mean celebrated in the way that I celebrate Ethan Peck's beard. He was known as a progressive icon, a man whose work transcended not only artistic achievement, but also did more, said more. But it was not just the work that was venerated, but the man himself. Joss Whedon became a deified symbol, a man placed on a pedestal as something unique in the medium, encapsulating the ideals of many who hoped to see progressive and social change in their favorite genre that they loved, but sometimes felt didn't love them back.
Last day of Comic-Con in the afternoon, and 5,000 people showed up to give us a standing ovation and to see Joss, see the cast, watch the first footage that had been seen from Serenity, and it was as if Mick Jagger had just walked onto the stage.
But it was this symbolification of Whedon that made it so shocking as, over the past few years, that man, that statue, on that pedestal has fallen so quickly from it. Numerous scandals and allegations have rocked Whedon's career about his conduct on not just recent projects, but projects spanning his entire career to this point, illustrating a pattern of behavior that cannot be easily dismissed as just a bad day, a bad project, a misunderstanding, or a bad actor attempting to harm Whedon, but instead showed cracks in that picturesque marble facade in that statue that was Whedon, that we all looked at from down below, glinting into the sunlight up at his visage. Yet, it was made even worse when on Martin Luther King Jr. Day 2022, which, by the way, how in dear heavens is it already 2022? That doesn't seem real. But regardless, on that day, Hollywood Magazine released an article titled The Undoing of Joss Whedon, which, among chronicling and discussing the numerous allegations that I've already mentioned, also featured Whedon's first interview and responses to said allegations. And those responses were, not great. Let's just go with not great for right now, and we'll get into it in a second. But the reaction to Whedon's words has seemed to finally cement the cultural view of Whedon not as that godlike statue anymore, but as a statue that has fallen and broken on the ground. In fact, it's kind of shocking how this story has gone. He seems to have swung from one extreme to the other. He has gone from god to outright villain, a hack, a horrible creator, and an even worse human being. A man whose creative work was never really that good in the first place, and whose shittiness as a person was clearly on display in all of those old shows.
It's amazing how a hack like Joss Whedon managed to ruin movies for an entire generation. Joss Whedon is a bad fic writer who demands attention from everyone at all times for his shitty work.
Joss Whedon is another writer who time has revealed to be not actually good at writing, just clever enough to fake it.
Stick that hyperbolicism on a thumbnail and set it loose in the algorithm to see it fly. From God to demon. Hero to zero, just like that. Did I just quote Disney's Hercules? I didn't mean to do that. It wasn't intentional. But Whedon has not been the only creator who has seen this trajectory. Every year, there seems to be more and more creators who used to be seen as titans of virtue for both their creative and real-life works, whose foundation at the base of their pedestals has begun to show cracks, has begun to falter. Another example that many of us probably are thinking of is J.K. Rowling. Oh boy. Look at me. A trans is talking about J.K. Rowling again. If I had a nickel for every time a trans person talked about J.K. Rowling, I'd have a fuck ton of nickels. But even if we ignore Rowling's controversial discourse on trans people for a moment, it would be accurate to say that the woman who was famed for being so philanthropic that she lost her billionaire status, and who wrote one of the most famous fictional metaphor dissections of how systemic systems of oppression work, still has further boggarts in her closet. From accusations of shallow gay representation to problematic Asian representations to the goblins. Yes, we'll be talking about the goblins. There are certainly issues to talk about with Rowling beyond the rowdy transes. And it's interesting to me that that was the discourse that finally started this toppling of Rowling's statue, but still hasn't fully toppled it over. Despite everything that we could discuss about Rowling, she's still up on that pedestal. In seeming opposition to Whedon, whose statue has seemingly fallen and cracked into a bunch of pieces, while Rowling's statue has wobbled, it hasn't toppled over yet. She still has numerous books, video games, game shows, movies, and more being released with both her direct and indirect involvement from her creative properties. All this despite Rowling perhaps being even more controversial than Whedon. Some would even argue more widely harmful, given her further spreading polarized and politicized discourse on trans people in a time when trans identities are deeply politicized and under attack, compared to Whedon's darker and more direct, yet perhaps more distinctly contained harm. It's hard to argue and ultimately purposeless to argue who was worse, but it is interesting to me that Whedon has fallen and Rowling still seems to have her followers. But, like Whedon, though, there are those for whom Rowling is a demon, a villain, the worst human being who has ever lived. But, on the other side, there are some who think she's a saint, a symbol of women's rights, a statue of perfection, and even the best writer of our time.
Thank you, not just for being an amazing writer, but also for standing up for women. If everyone had your courage, the world would be a better place. Hashtag I stand with J.K. Rowling.
Dear J.K. Rowling, happy birthday. You are an amazing writer and a wonderful human being. Thank you for standing up for women, while being so kind and respectful towards the people who disagree with you. I hope you have a great day with your loved ones. Many happy returns.
Well done for not capitulating to the narcissistic woke mob. J.K. Rowling is an amazing writer and a protector of children and women.
And there doesn't seem to be much middle ground there. But that list doesn't stop at Whedon and Rowling. There are many creators seen as creative geniuses and progressive icons in equal measure whose image has been challenged in recent years, and the discourse around them rages. Paragons of virtue or arbiters of disgust, who made works of either perfection or trash, usually equated with what you think of the person themselves. But within all of this, I sit here unsure. While certainly I am acutely aware of the harm that these two and others have caused, and have done many videos on both of them over the past few years, especially on Miss Joanne, because otherwise I'd have to turn my trans card in. But even so, despite all of that, I still feel like something is missing from the discussion. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Firefly, Harry Potter, these are all works that I cherished at different parts of my life, that inspired me to become the creator I am today, the person that I am today. I looked up to both Whedon and Rowling. It would be a lie to say that I didn't. My personal and professional life would look very different if not for the influence of both of them. And yet, I also look back at those works today, not only with pain due to the problems of the creators who made them, but also I can start to see the cracks that I missed before. Flaws, even in the initial marble before a chisel was even taken to it. And it becomes difficult for me to hold both these things in my mind. The hope that the art and those creators inspired, and the pain and problems that I now see within them both. But I feel both of those things, the inspiration and the pain. I feel them both at the same time. And so when I look out into the discourse, I see people so sure of their love or hatred, and I'm less sure. I wrestle with it every day. And yet these binarized viewpoints continually play out in a battlefield right in front of our very eyes, and I see something else as a result. The nuance lost in that endless, polarized discourse. Conversations desperately needed to be had, eschewed for more antagonistic discussions. And I feel that not only does it prevent us from actually honing in on the true feelings, the true issues, but it prevents us from actually being constructive and actually working to prevent these events from happening again in the future. Even more, I see real harm being both perpetuated and hidden by this antagonism. How often things like transphobia is hidden behind a phrase like, "I support J.K. Rowling." But how even me just saying that automatically probably puts some of you watching this video into feeling defensive of not only J.K. Rowling, but of yourself. How discussions of the problems of a creator start to make us feel defensive of our own self and our own views, without actually listening to the perspective of those who have felt the pain and experience caused by these events. And also, I see how we fail to wrestle with what it means to make art and to be human at the same time, while alternatively often forgetting the humanity of those who were harmed in the process of making that art. The folks whose humanity was already ignored when they were making the art in the first place by those who held power over them. And so, I want to use Whedon and Rowling, who to me represent two sides of the same coin, as case studies to look at how both the deification and vilification of creators like them, in equal measure, limits our ability to critically analyze both their creative works and actions in a nuanced way that actually enables us to constructively move forward to prevent these types of harmful events and problematic portrayals from happening in the first place. And moreover, often perpetuates, obfuscates, and outright incites further harm to every single person involved, past and present, in the initial events, in the artwork, and the ongoing discussion. Woo! Hello, everybody. I'm trying something new right now. I'm trying to go for the sexy professor look. I'm hoping I'm pulling it off and I don't just look like a giant dork. But anyways, before we get into the main topic of this video, let's talk about something fun. As I spoke about in my last video about the Matrix Resurrections, which, by the way, if you haven't watched that video, I know it's super long, but please go watch it. It was a very much a passion video for me, and it was about a fun subject analyzing the politics and queer themes of an amazingly underappreciated movie and franchise that I just really adored. But regardless, the reason I was able to make that type of video and make it as in-depth and long as it was, as I announced in that video, is because I was able to recently join Nebula, which is the curated streaming platform that's now Streamy Award nominated that allows me and my fellow educational style YouTube creators like PhilosophyTube, Cat Black, FD Signifier, and Foreign Man in a Foreign Land, and so many other people who are way freaking cooler than this dorky, trekkie butt trying to pull off vest stuff, to have a place to make videos that are away from the worries of the algorithm and to have access to some really cool production resources and a lot of opportunities, and most importantly to me, have a chance to do all of that while also having more financial stability. All of that allows me to make more outside of the box content like that Matrix Resurrections video that I'm also going to be excited to share with you over on Nebula as well now. And on top of that, while I don't have anything to announce yet, I am working on some Nebula exclusive content, and there's a lot of other Nebula exclusive content from creators that you probably love. For example, I personally adored PhilosophyTube's Nebula exclusive behind the scenes documentary that she just put out. And I'll admit it, I may have just watched the documentary for tips about how she does her costumes, because I honestly aspire to that, but as I spoke about before, the only way that I was able to get onto Nebula was because of all of you, and I want to thank you all for your support. But also, one of the major ways that Nebula is itself supported is through its partnership with the amazing CuriosityStream, a subscription streaming service with thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles. So if Nebula is the place for nerdy and education-y creators like myself to try out new ideas, CuriosityStream is all about the big budget professional docs. In fact, one of my favorite documentaries that I recently watched on there was the one Armstrong, because, you know, giant space nerd, what else am I going to watch on there? It was really good, it was a lot of fun, I really enjoyed it, and it's an awesome service that has so many more documentaries like that for all of you nerdy people out there. But even better than that, CuriosityStream and Nebula have joined together like the Power Rangers. I'm doing all the dorky references here. Regardless, they formed together to form a partnership to make each other stronger. The two of them have worked out a deal where if you sign up at my link below for CuriosityStream, not only do you get access to CuriosityStream itself, but you're also going to get Nebula for free. Not a trial, not a test, but full Nebula access and access to my pretty face for as long as you're a CuriosityStream member. And also, for a limited time, CuriosityStream is offering that at an exclusive discount for the annual plan at 26%, which is just $14.79. So you get my pretty face, other people's pretty faces, some cool documentaries, and some learning, all for pretty cheap. And also, seriously too, especially as someone new to Nebula, using that URL below not only gets you all of that, but it does actually specifically help me out, getting me more sponsorship, getting me more attention, helps this channel grow for me to be able to do more stuff on here and on Nebula. So it's really a win for anybody, and I can, you know, buy more costumes. Like, that's what I want, people. I want to buy more costumes. Let me buy more costumes. But seriously, it will actually help me out and actually help me get like good equipment and help editing and all that fun stuff, but also the costumes. So click on the link in the description or go to the URL, it really helps me out. But with all of that said, I want to say thank you to CuriosityStream for sponsoring this video, and I have one last final tease before we get into the meat of this, and that is at the end of this, I have an announcement about a new project that I think many of you have been asking me for quite a bit. So stick around to the end of this video, or, you know, skip to the end if that's what you want to do, if you're curious about what that is. And so, thank you to everyone who helps. Thank you to CuriosityStream, and extra special thank you to all my patrons who also make all of this possible, and I couldn't do this without you. And with that, on with the show. Okay, so I've taken off the makeup, which took me a lot more time than I actually anticipated. That makeup was a hell of a time getting off. My bathroom currently looks like I murdered a ghost in it, and it's gonna be a little bit of time cleaning up, but it was a lot of fun to do, and I hoped that it helped to visually represent the idea that I want to get across with this video. But for the rest of this discussion, I want to be less theatrical and just more conversational. And the reason I want to do that is because I think that's what this discourse should be. A conversation, not a lecture or dictation of my opinions to you, because my views on this are not chiseled into stone, but complex and difficult, as I'm sure yours are. I'll be honest with you, I started writing this video the day that Joss Whedon article came out. I even sat down on that day to record a video that I had hoped to get out the next day, and I kept doing it over and over and over again, kept restarting and kept redoing it. And so I decided that I needed to write a bigger script, the video that you're watching right now, but for the next 2 weeks after that, I kept wanting to. It was on my to-do list to write that script, and I just couldn't do it because I was honestly scared to jump into it. It took me a long time to be able to sit down and just really be like, all right, I'm gonna confront my thoughts and feelings around this whole situation. And so now that I've finally written it and I'm sitting here filming it, I want you to know that this video will have my thoughts and opinions, but they're meant to be in conversation with yours. This is not me telling you how to think or feel, but me telling you how I feel right now and hoping that maybe you'll connect to it and maybe that'll help us both. With that said, though, let's talk about Joss Whedon. Just a few years ago, Joss Whedon was riding high as one of the biggest names in Hollywood. Not only was he one of the writers on Toy Story, as well as the creator of venerated genre classic TV shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Angel, Firefly, and I guess, dollhouse. He also directed Avengers and its sequel, Avengers Age of Ultron, 2 films that helped to shepherd in the current age of Marvel dominance in pop culture. I mean, hell, while certainly last year was an abnormal one for the box office, it's still incredibly notable that 30% of box office revenue in 2021 came from Marvel films. Not to mention all the Marvel TV shows that were also started by Whedon's work on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And this isn't even to say how his works like Buffy have in many ways become the template for numerous genre shows after it, with everything from Riverdale to Arrowverse to even shades of Orange is the New Black, with its women-dominated series balancing dark themes with comedic humor, which itself set the stage for Netflix's dominance. All of that being influenced by Joss Whedon's style. Joss Whedon and his effect on pop culture is quite honestly immeasurable. Yet more importantly, it wasn't that Joss Whedon's works were just considered to be good, but that they were saying something. While certainly horror movies were often female-led decades before Whedon, Buffy the Vampire Slayer centered around a female heroine who was not only the center of the story, but was also steadfastly defined not as a victim, but as the superpower protagonist who had agency in propelling her own story forward in a genre that typically denied women that agency. The series was often celebrated for breaking down sexist tropes, for example with the fashion and status-obsessed Cordelia eventually being shown as a not shallow high school rival, but a character with depth to her surface-level shallowness.
Buffy, these men are rich, and I'm not being shallow. Think of all the poor people I could help with all my money.
And a true kindness and maturity in her that evolved over the seasons of the show and into the spin-off series Angel. All the while never changing her from that Mean Girls-esque exterior, and actually showing that women like that can actually be fully rounded people. It's not only centered women, but eventually even queer women with characters like Willow. And it also showed men in new roles as well. It showed men as the love interest or the non-physically defined emotional support.
I laugh in the face of danger, then I hide until it goes away.
Xander, you'll always have a place in my heart. Firefly also continued the trend, which, while not being a huge hit like Buffy, became a cult classic celebrated for not only its witty writing, but for featuring a sex worker, a priest, and a woman of color in prominent roles that often defied tropes. While today this type of representation has become more commonplace, though still with its own issues, back then it was still a mild irregularity in TV, science fiction, and fantasy on network television. Unless you were watching Xena, in which case nothing probably shocks you at this point. And so for all of this, as I said earlier, Whedon became a celebrated god on 2 fronts: his well-received writing and his platforming of important issues with his work. And back when I was younger, I fell into that first camp. I would be lying if I didn't say that my own choice to go to film school and become a writer and video creator wasn't directly influenced by my love of things like Firefly or Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. And yeah, on that note, I may have had a Captain Hammer cosplay back when I had a neck beard and also much less estrogen in my system. Whedon, to me at the time, represented everything I hoped to achieve in my career, though hopefully with slightly more cleavage in mine, though that element of it seemed surprisingly less achievable at the time. Funny how that worked out. I got the boobs, but not the career success, at least not yet. But like Whedon, I wanted to be a nerd creator who not only got to tell cool stories, but inspired the world to be a little bit better in the process. And this wasn't isolated to me. A close friend of mine spoke to me regularly about how Buffy allowed them to finally see themselves as powerful, as important, as someone with agency, something they cherished, as their agency in real life had sometimes been denied to them, in sometimes very traumatic ways. And there were many, millions of people who felt the same way about his work. His work meant so much to us. It irrevocably tied to us in our life. His work meant something. And this played out on every level of fandom. Go to a convention at the time, and even still to this day, and you'll find Joss Whedon is my master now t-shirts were common. Joss Whedon was on top of his game and the industry. A god, known as a feminist and stand-up guy, and understandably so, at least externally. In many ways, it wasn't unearned, at least in terms of his public-facing account. And this depiction of him as artistic genius and virtuous icon helped to bolster his career success onto things like the Avengers movies. Even further, he felt this sense of godhood not only just from his fans, but in his workplace as well. He had cast and crew from the TV shows that he worked on regularly visit his own home.
I don't know many writers who don't revere his works. I grew up listening to them, reading them. seeing them, and you know, it's been a passion of mine for a long time. I had friends come over to the house to read the plays.
And he signed posters for his own staff. As one writer for Buffy stated, quote, "The standard reaction to Joss was worship." And yet, we talk about the effects of his work upon us, the audience at the time, and those around him, yet we never really talk about the effect on Whedon himself. Because when everyone around you sees you as a god, from the people you work for, to the people you work with, to the people who enjoy your work, doesn't that seem like it might affect you?
Just glazed to their eyes, like, what was that? I'm like, that was fame.
If you're a god, aren't gods entitled to be listened to? To have what they want? To be worshipped? And what if people don't give you what you're entitled to? This is where we start to get to the allegations against Joss Whedon, which begin around this time when he was working on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, when his reputation was beginning to be garnered. Now, being clear, I am not going to go over every single allegation against Whedon in this video. My dear and wonderful friend Vera Wild already did an amazing breakdown of the biggest parts on her video that I highly recommend. So just know that going in, I'm going to talk about specific ones, but I'm not going to talk about every single one. But for now, let's talk about some illuminating allegations to discuss what I'm trying to get at here in this video. One early allegation came from Spike actor James Marsters. The character of Spike on Buffy the Vampire Slayer was initially intended to just be a one-off villain, but became so popular to the point where he was demanded by the audience to stay on the show, despite not initially being considered as a long-term character. Think of him kind of like the Daryl or Castiel or Riker's Beard of his day. Yet Spike's popularity was something that went against Joss Whedon's wishes as the writer of the show. Whedon initially only envisioned Spike to be a few episode arc villain. Spike's ongoing popularity wasn't his design, and so it made Joss angry at Marsters specifically. And so he supposedly lashed out violently.
No, I was terrified of Joss.
Really?
Absolutely terrified.
I've never met him, but he's seen. I thought he was just
such a nice guy. And I remember he backed me up against a wall one day, and he was just like, "I don't care how popular you are, kid. You're dead. You hear me? You're dead, dead." And I was just like, it's your football, man. Like, okay,
Wait, was he kidding around?
No, hell no. Hell no.
He was angry with you?
He was angry at the situation, I think. Or he was
Did he ever apologize?
No, why should he?
Yeah, well, that was just a one-off incident. The same can't be said for Cordelia actress Charisma Carpenter, who stated,
Joss Whedon abused his power on numerous occasions while working together on the sets of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel. While he found his misconduct amusing, it only served to intensify my performance anxiety, disempower me, and alienate me from my peers. The disturbing incidents triggered a chronic physical condition from which I still suffer. It is with a beating heavy heart that I say I coped in isolation and, at times, destructively. Joss has a history of being casually cruel. He has created hostile and toxic work environments since his early career. I know because I experienced it firsthand, repeatedly. Like his ongoing passive-aggressive threats to fire me, which wreaks havoc on a young actor's self-esteem, and callously calling me fat to colleagues when I was 4 months pregnant, weighing 126 pounds. He was mean and biting, disparaging about others openly, and often played favorites, pitting people against one another to compete and vie for his attention and approval. He called me in for a sit-down meeting to interrogate and berate me regarding a rosary tattoo I got to help me feel more spiritually grounded in an increasingly volatile work climate that affected me physically. Joss intentionally refused multiple calls from my agent, making it impossible to connect with him to tell him the news that I was pregnant. Finally, once Joss was apprised of the situation, he requested a meeting with me. In that closed-door meeting, he asked if I was going to keep it and manipulatively weaponize my womanhood and faith against me. He proceeded to attack my character, mock my religious beliefs, accuse me of sabotaging the show, and then unceremoniously fired me the following season once I gave birth.
Now, there's already been a lot of breaking down of Charisma Carpenter's statements, the harassment and abuse that they entail and sort of depict. But what I want to focus on here is, again, that sense of ownership that Whedon seemed to display towards Carpenter. That he was entitled to say things about her body, talking about her pregnancy or her tattoo as if he could dictate her bodily autonomy. While certainly as a showrunner, he has some aspect of needing to be aware of his actor's physical features and body so he knows what he can and can't write for, again, he had that sense that he got to control her entire body, whether she was on or off set. But while Carpenter was probably the biggest incident of this, there are a lot of smaller incidents that also showcase this exact same dynamic. Like when Joss Whedon saw a costume for Buffy actress Sarah Michelle Gellar and thought it wasn't sexy enough for the scene.
Sarah was adamant about it being a certain way, Bergstrom said. The costume she wanted was a bit grandma-ish, a pleated skirt and a high neck. Joss definitely wanted it to be sexier. On the day Gellar tried the different options, Whedon grew frustrated. I was like, Joss, let's just get her dressed, Bergstrom recalled. He grabbed my arm and dug in his fingertips until his fingernails imprinted the skin, and I said, "You're hurting me."
Now, there are sadly many more stories that are detailed in the article The Undoing of Joss Whedon, if you're curious. But they all paint stories of a man who, to me, saw the world around him as owned by him, as controlled by him. And when he didn't get his way, when something came along that showcased that that wasn't true, he would react with belittling, ridicule, and violence. I know, to a degree, I'm armchair psychoanalyzing a man that I don't know here, but I just constantly see that as a consistent underlying theme in his story. A man who usually got his way reacting in harmful ways when he didn't. When he was confronted with the fact that the world didn't actually bow to him. But I think the story that illuminates this most, is with his wife at the time, Kai Cole. A few years ago, Joss Whedon's ex-wife Kai Cole released an essay with allegations against Whedon, stating that not only did he cheat on her while he was working on Buffy the Vampire Slayer with actresses, coworkers, fans, and friends on the show, but that she also felt that she couldn't speak up about these affairs specifically because of the cult of personality built up around Whedon. She eventually stated, quote,
"He used his relationship with me as a shield, so no one would question his relationships with other women or scrutinize his writing as anything other than feminist."
Now obviously, cheating on your partner is wrong and messed up, not only for the fact that you're betraying the trust that that person put in you, but also because you're not allowing them to be fully aware of a situation and therefore not able to fully consent to anything that you do within that relationship, both physically or emotionally. But there's also the nature of the really messed up power dynamics that Joss Whedon was displaying when he was sleeping with women on a show for which he held power over them as their boss. But while that is all messed up, it doesn't necessarily illustrate this sense of entitlement that I was talking about earlier. What does display that, though, is when we hear Joss's side of the story when it comes to these affairs. In the Hollywood Magazine article, Joss Whedon responded to these allegations, admitting to them and stating,
When I pressed him on why, he noted,
"It messes up the power dynamic."
but he didn't expand on that thought. Instead, he quickly added that he had felt he
had
to sleep with them, that he was
powerless
to resist. I laughed.
"I'm not actually joking,"
he said. He had been surrounded by beautiful young women, the sort of women who had ignored him when he was younger, and he feared if he didn't have sex with them, he would
always regret it.
It's interesting how Joss describes this, right? That he had to sleep with them, that he was powerless to, that he sort of removes his own agency from his own choices. And I think it goes back to this idea that he was venerated, he was seen as this important person, and so he was not only entitled to people's bodies, but that he had to take it. That's what he deserved. That's what he needed to take advantage of, because that's what he earned as a god, as this man who is venerated on the set. He was compelled to take what was owed to him. At least, that's how he saw it. No recognition of the autonomy of these women, or his relationship to the power he held, or even his own agency in perpetuating these affairs. Keep in mind how this idea of this deification, this exaltation of this man, started to, even in the person himself, take away his own agency. To say, it wasn't me who did that, I had to do it. I had no control. We'll be coming back to that in just a little bit. Yet at the same time though, while he did feel entitled to these women's bodies, he also felt entitled to his marriage with Kai at the same time. As Kai stated in her post, quote,
Joss admitted that for the next decade and a half, he hid multiple affairs and a number of inappropriate emotional ones that he had with his actresses, coworkers, fans, and friends while he stayed married to me. He wrote me a letter when our marriage was falling apart, but I still didn't know the whole truth, and said,
"I've never loved anyone or wanted to be with anyone in any real or long-term way except for you ever. And I love our life. I love how you are, how we are, who you are, and what we've done both separately and together, how much fun we had."
He wanted it all. He didn't want to choose, so he accepted the duality as a part of his life. Then later, after he confessed everything, he told me,
I let myself love you. I stopped worrying about the contradictions. As a guilty man, I knew the only way to hide was to act as though I were righteous. And as a husband, I wanted to be with you like we had been. I lived 2 lives.
When he walked out of our marriage and was trying to make things seem less bewildering, to help me understand how he could have lied to me for so long, he said,
In many ways, I was the height of normal in this culture. We're taught to be providers and companions and at the same time to conquer and acquire, specifically sexually, and I was pulling off both.
Kai's sharing of Whedon's own word underscores a man who thought he could have everything, that he should have everything, that he could have a marriage and side relationships at the same time, that he could have that duality, and that they were contradictory, but both acceptable in his life. That he could have both. It was a contradiction, sure, but he was big enough to handle the contradiction. He was Joss fucking Whedon. He was a god. He could have everything, even if it ignored other people's autonomy and right to choose. It was all about him. It's interesting to compare this situation with Joss to more actually ethical, open, and polyamorous relationships, because those can work. People in a committed marriage or relationship can have other relationships as well and make it work ethically, but it requires everyone involved to be aware and to recognize the autonomy of everyone else involved, to be open and honest with every single person, and to set rules and boundaries and lines to not be crossed, and be very clear in that. But Joss Whedon didn't afford that to anyone in this situation. He had power over the actresses he slept with, and he refused to tell the truth to his wife and give her autonomy over her own body and choices. Everything in this situation was centered and catered to Joss's desires and autonomy, even when he seemed to realize he was doing wrong. He knew he shouldn't be doing this to anyone, and yet his desires to him superseded everyone else's. As Kai stated,
despite understanding on some level that what he was doing was wrong, he never conceded the hypocrisy of being out in the world preaching feminist ideals, while at the same time taking away my right to make choices for my life and my body based on the truth. He deceived me for 15 years so he could have everything he wanted.
And I want to be clear here. I'm trying to get to this point that everything in Joss's world told him that he was the most important person in it, and that others were an extension of himself, there for him, not for their own needs or lives or desires. And whenever that view was challenged, he acted out, harming others or lying and denying that it was happening to them. And this continued throughout his career. When we get to his controversial takeover of the Justice League movie after Zack Snyder was pushed out by Warner Brothers, one of the first and biggest allegations about his behavior on that set came from Cyborg actor Ray Fisher. As the Hollywood article details,
the actors, at least some of them, felt Whedon had been rude too. Ray Fisher, a young black actor, played Cyborg. It was his first major role. Snyder had centered the film on his character, the first black superhero in a DC movie, and he treated Fisher as a writing partner, soliciting his opinions on the film's representation of black people. Whedon downsized Cyborg's role, cutting scenes that, in Fisher's view, challenged stereotypes. When Fisher raised his concerns about the revisions in a phone call, Whedon cut him off.
It feels like I'm taking notes right now,
Whedon told him, according to The Hollywood Reporter.
And I don't take notes from anybody, not even Robert Downey Jr.
For Ray Fisher, the role of Cyborg was important to him for 2 reasons. First and foremost, it was his first big movie role, a highlight for his career, his first big step. And so of course the man is going to have a vested personal interest in that character having a more prominent role in the movie. Which, by the way, the character supposedly had when the movie was under Zack Snyder's vision. And we can clearly see that sort of reflected in the Snyder Cut that came out in 2021. Though that version of the film was clearly not what was going to be released in theaters had Snyder been able to control it from beginning to end initially. But still, we get an idea that Cyborg was going to play a larger, more prominent role in the initial version of that movie. Beyond that, it was also the first major black superhero in the current DC superhero universe. Though, to be fair, to correct the Hollywood article, it was not the first black DC superhero movie ever. Let us not forget Catwoman or Steel. Or maybe it's best to. But seriously, jokes aside, while those movies aren't great, we shouldn't forget the representation that they helped to bring about within the superhero genre. Getting back to today, Cyborg, the character, did represent an important moment for representation in DC films, especially in the present day. I mean, look how celebrated and appreciated the movie Black Panther was by the black community for its authentic portrayal of black characters and cultures. One needed only look at that to recognize how important this type of representation still is today. So, the character of Cyborg was important to get right, especially to Ray Fisher. So to see this important role for both him and his community cut back and changed, especially when he had been reportedly given much more creative input when the film was under Snyder's purview, was deeply concerning to Fisher. But to Joss, Ray Fisher's concerns weren't even heard, weren't even listened to. To Joss, it was just Ray Fisher giving him notes. And Joss Whedon doesn't take notes. Not even from Iron Man himself, though one need only take one look at Age of Ultron's adherence to the numerous masters of the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a refutation of that. So if you look at that, it's interesting to see how Joss Whedon will take dictation from executives, but not from the folks who ostensibly should be his creative partners on a project, like actors, like Ray Fisher. Because Ray Fisher doesn't get any say in Joss Whedon's vision. This isn't to say that Joss Whedon couldn't have had a say or shouldn't have had the definitive say on the creative version of the project. It's not his fault that Warner Brothers treated Zack Snyder like crap and wanted the vision changed. Perhaps he shouldn't have taken the job in the first place, but given that he did, in this situation, he was supposed to be the defining voice of this version of the movie. But the issue was, he didn't even listen to Ray Fisher's concerns, recognizing that Ray Fisher's concerns were coming from a real place on Fisher's own terms. Instead, he dismissed them rudely and out of hand because they didn't align with his view, despite the fact that Ray Fisher should have been his creative partner in the endeavor, even if ultimately Joss would have disagreed with Ray Fisher's version of the film. Ray Fisher's situation is the most illuminative, but you see shades of this same dynamic with Gal Gadot's worry of her powerful female Amazonian warrior Wonder Woman being reduced to a sex joke in Joss Whedon's reshoots. A worry which was again dismissed by Joss and that he did anyways, even with Gadot actively refusing to shoot the scene and forcing him to use a body double to undermine Wonder Woman's sense of power and being a female hero not defined by sexualization. But speaking of that exact scene in the theatrical cut of Justice League, interestingly, it showcases how this sense of women's bodies being able to be used by men seeped into Joss Whedon's on-screen work. Because if we put this lens onto it, we can look back at all of Joss Whedon's work and see these recurring themes there too. How often women felt disposable, such as with the characters of Fred, Cordelia, or Darla in the TV show Angel. Or how Darla was often weirdly objectified in her very Oedipal storyline between her, Angel, and their son, Connor. Or how characters like Black Widow, while badass, were often sexualized and even called cunts in another language on screen.
This is my bargain, you mewling quim.
We could also talk about the appropriation of Chinese culture in Firefly without including any characters from that culture or few folks working behind the scenes from that culture, showcasing a sense from Joss Whedon that he felt that it was okay to use another culture as a creative and cool idea without actually representing it well or with the people who are from that culture, that he felt entitled to use that culture because it was a cool creative idea. Or how Dollhouse was a show about people, mainly women, being used as blank, empty human beings imprinted with personality for usage by the rich and powerful and often by men. And how the character who imprinted these women with personality in that show, Toofer, is the character that Joss Whedon himself most actively identified with.
Love is a selfish emotion.
And altruism isn't. Break it down. Helping others makes us feel good about ourselves.
It's not that simple.
I program them so that it feels good. What? So I'm a monster, right?
I'm compiling a report.
Kind of telling there, right? How he felt that he got to control these women's personalities, got to control their lives and how they existed in the world, and that he was doing so for an audience of mainly men. I don't want to read too much into that, but Joss Whedon himself has made the connection between Toofer and himself.
Whedon told Leigh he identified with a character in Dollhouse, Toofer, the nerdy scientist who imprints the dolls with their personalities.
Or we could also talk about how while Buffy was a series defined by a strong woman with agency, how there were still many times where that agency was denied to her, such as when she was sexually assaulted by Spike, a character who would later be redeemed by vaguely earning a soul, but without directly addressing what he did. or how the world around Buffy was defined by predator men whose identities could shift without warning, trying to control her body and desiring her, to eat her, to consume her. Considering all of this, there are many things that we could discuss within Joss Whedon's writings and how it had intensely problematic stuff in it, an analysis that would warrant its whole video. But the point that I'm getting here, though, is that Joss's behavior was in many ways reflected in his work, if we are willing to look for it. One that is both suggestive of how he viewed the world and himself within it, and how he was viewed by the world around him. You see, in real life, we all see ourselves as the protagonists in our own stories. And so when the whole world is telling you that you're a god, our instinct is to create a story in our head that justifies us having that power. Justifying and saying that you have earned it, that you deserve it. And then once you've made that story in your head, then you start to make decisions based on that story. A lot of Joss's harmful actions in the real world directly stem from this sense of ownership and entitlement. Now, there's more to it than simply that, but let's put a pin in that because we'll be coming back to it towards the end of this video. But that's the point that I want to end this section with. That Joss Whedon was told that he was a god, and he started to believe it. Because he started believing it, it started to affect how he saw those around him, as extensions of himself that he had a right to, as opposed to people in their own right. But while the world for a very long time told Joss Whedon that he was a god, eventually, after all these allegations came out, there was a turn. After all these allegations against him came to life, the narrative around Joss Whedon started to shift. We're skipping a lot of stuff between here and there, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but today, now, Joss's reputation seems to have completely shifted from that venerated godhood that he used to have. After the Undoing of Joss Whedon article was released with Joss Whedon's terrible responses, which I touched upon earlier, and again are more comprehensively discussed in Council of Geeks' video, the overriding discourse on Joss was far, far from positive. Like, very far from it.
Joss Whedon is a pseudo-intellectual hack that read Hamlet and decided his own overly verbose, embarrassingly purple writing was as deep as he perceived a piece of 10th grade lit to be. Absolutely fuck that bald, pretentious little nerd.
As Whedon himself pointed out in the article,
nobody ever fell from a pedestal into anything but a ditch.
And in many ways, he's very right on that front. He certainly seems to have fallen into a ditch. As those tweets illustrated, his work is now viewed through the lens I spoke about before, shone through a lens of the damage that he caused, and rightfully so. And he himself is viewed as a terrible figure, and on many levels he deserves it for his actions. And yet, even this discussion of how harmful that Joss Whedon has been is still filtered through this hyperbolization. While Joss Whedon is no longer a god for some, he is something else. He is the devil. Yet, there are people who still love his work, and therefore defend him as a person.
Hashtag I stand with Joss Whedon. He did nothing wrong and makes great productions. However, this Ray Fisher, literally who? I don't know. Sounds like some out to make a quick buck and ruin a good man's reputation.
Marvel is the most unproblematic genre of film history. Hashtag I stand with Joss Whedon.
It's shocking and heartbreaking what's happened to Joss Whedon's career, but one thing doesn't make sense. He had issues on the Justice League set, but no one came forward with issues when he was making Marvel movies. Hashtag I stand with Joss Whedon.
Even today, even after everything that's happened, Joss Whedon is still viewed in these very binarized and hyperbolicized terms, God or villain. And I cannot help but feel that none of that is ultimately helpful to the discussion. The defense or ignorance of Joss Whedon's actions because of the importance of his works makes invisible all the harm caused by his actions, the hurt inflicted upon those like Charisma Carpenter, Ray Fisher, and so many more. These fans have taken their love of his work and intrinsically linked it to their aggrandizement of him as a person, so much so that they cannot be separated. And so defense of their love of his work becomes wrapped up in the reputation and defense of a man's harmful actions. Because the creator and creation have become so intertwined, both the work of arts that he made and the person who he is must be adamantly defended. And to question one means to question the other. Both must be perfect, because if Joss Whedon is perfect, then so is his creation. But if the thing that he made was this perfect, amazing thing of goodness, it had to have been made by a perfect, amazing, good man. It couldn't have been made by a man who is problematic. And so to question either of these things would be to question their view of the other thing. And so people who love Whedon's work, as they could and should even to this day, they feel a need to defend Whedon as a person because of it, which again makes invisible all the harm that happened behind the scenes and the problems that are on screen in the stories themselves. And yet, on the other side, I feel like the calling of Joss Whedon's work as trash and Joss Whedon as a terrible devil, demonic human being misses a lot as well. To treat him as the devil and his works as garbage dismisses that the work did mean something to people, that there is still a lot of good in it. Buffy the Vampire Slayer did change many things. It inspired so many. It inspired me. There's still so much good to be found in Buffy the Vampire Slayer and all of Joss Whedon's works. And also, it's important to recognize that it was work done by hundreds of people beyond Whedon himself, including many of the people that he hurt, like Ray Fisher or Carpenter. To dismiss his work as hacky ignores the many important themes inherent within them and the artistry on display. But again, we see a converse sort of attitude here to the other folks, that they view now Joss Whedon as a horrific human being, and so therefore his work cannot contain any good either. They've intrinsically linked both things, so to say one is good would be to say that Whedon is good, which we can't have. And so because of this hyperbolicized conversation, it allows us to not critically both analyze the works of art that Whedon made, or him, in any sort of nuanced way. If we take things out of these hyperbolicized terms, it's important to note that we can hold that a work of art can be inspiring and that it can also have horrific elements. In fact, every single piece of art has that. Some in different quantities, but no piece of art is perfect. Buffy the Vampire Slayer can be a work that meant a lot to the representation of powerful women and many other things. And it can also have perpetuated some deeply sinister and harmful tropes at the same time. But more importantly, it causes us to not look at Whedon as a human being who committed these acts. If we ascribe Whedon with inherent evilness or goodness, it denies that he is a man from a system that propped him up this way, that enabled him to feel this way, and that his actions came from a real place, a human place. That's not to say that any of his actions were okay or acceptable in any way, shape, or form, but to cast these actions as the work of an inherently evil human being allows us to ignore that this wasn't just something that came out of nowhere, but actually came from somewhere, not just an inherent supernatural villainy, like a vampire in the night. On another hand, it also allows him to not critically look at himself too. When I hear Joss Whedon talk about the controversies and allegations against him in the Hollywood Magazine article, there's this sense of self-pity and victimhood in all of his words.
I was made a target by my ex-wife and people exploited that cynically. She put out a letter saying some bad things I'd done and saying some untrue things about me, but I had done the bad things, and so people knew I was gettable. The beginning of the internet raised me up, and the modern internet pulled me down. The perfect symmetry is not lost on me.
He's not recognizing what he did was wrong, because he doesn't have to. He thinks of himself, as I said, as the hero of his own story, so he can reject in his own mind any narrative that places him as inherently villainous. He doesn't see himself as the antagonist of his own story. He couldn't see himself that way. That's not how human brains work. And so when he sees people casting him as the antagonist, as this villainous person, he can instantly reject any narrative that casts himself as such. He can dismiss them out of hand, and it leads to this lack of critical analysis that we can see in the article's final quote from him.
Could I have done a better marriage? Don't get me started. Could I have been a better showrunner? Absolutely. Should I have been nicer? I think I'm one of the nicer showrunners that's ever been.
It's just so telling, right? That he just can't bring himself to admit that maybe he wasn't a good person as a showrunner. He can't even admit that he was imperfect. He has to say that he was the nicest showrunner that ever existed. That he was still perfect in one area. Yeah, maybe he made some mistakes here and there. No hero of a story is perfect. That would just be a Mary Sue. But he was still intrinsically good. He was still intrinsically a good person, a protagonist worthy of the story that he's telling himself. At least to himself. Wouldn't it be better if he was just able to decouple that story and realize, I'm not the villain necessarily. I'm a human who did some horrible, shitty stuff. And I need to recognize that. I need to recognize that I did shitty things to other people. But he doesn't do that. because he's refused to allow other people to be seen as possible protagonists of their own stories. He feels entitled to that story of himself as the hero. Now, I'm not saying that we need to be worried about Joss Whedon's sense of the harm he caused, though I'm sure some folks would like a true apology. While I am certainly someone who argues that we should work for those who committed harmful acts to be given a chance to first pay their dues, but ultimately be able to reflect and grow if possible from their actions, though never be given the same amount of positions of power again, the more important factor, as it should be in every case, is that he is no longer able to perpetuate that harm, and that the people involved are able to get recognition for the harm that was caused to them. But, that being said, his lack of introspection, I think, reflects our lack of introspection about him too. We're refusing to recognize that he was a man of a system, that this system caused this to happen. That it wasn't just one man who was inherently villainous, but that it was a system that he got caught up in that created this dynamic in the first place. And because we don't recognize that, then it will happen again. And so to hyperbolicize this discourse does no one any favors. If we just say that he was bad and his work was bad, we get to wipe our hands clean. And if he was good, his work was perfect, everyone else was wrong, and we get to wipe our hands clean too. And to a lesser degree, it also doesn't allow us to look at his work and see what was inspiring about it and what was harmful about it. It just casts it all up as hero or villain, worthless or worthwhile. Yet, we're still missing something in this discussion, because this process in and of itself, of going from hero to villain, itself perpetuates harm. And we can see that in the process of it happening to someone right now. A person whose own pedestal is starting to crumble, yet is still currently remaining standing. J.K. Rowling. She has made some of the most venerated books of all time. Not this one. This one's trash, actually. But some of the other ones are, and they're also some of the best-selling books of all time, second only to God himself and his classic bestseller, the Bible. Though, to be fair, he did have a several thousand years head start on her, so he's kind of a little bit of a cheater. But that comparison is somewhat illustrative because J.K. Rowling herself has also earned that godlike reputation that Whedon had before her. Her books were not only lauded as important fantasy works, they were also great introductory metaphorical discussions of the issues of fascism and supremacy narratives within our society today. On top of that, she was also seen as a friend and advocate to LGBTQ folks, declaring things like Dumbledore was gay after the book came out. She is also an outspoken advocate on numerous issues and does a ton of charity work with children. And all of that is highly commendable and praiseworthy and amazing. I admit that, obviously. Yet, this also begins to give her that sense of virtuosity, of perfection as a creator that Joss Whedon had before her. And again, like Whedon, this virtuosity becomes wrapped up in the importance of her work of art as well. Because she's perfect, and Harry Potter is perfect and venerated, the two things become not only correlated, but causally linked in people's eyes. The books are perfect because she is, and she is perfect because the books are. And because of that, any criticism of the books somehow becomes reflective of J.K. Rowling's worth. Take, for example, how in January of 2022, comedian Jon Stewart had this exchange on his podcast.
Here's how you know Jews are still where they are. Talking to people, what I say is, have you ever seen a Harry Potter movie? And people are all like, I love the Harry Potter movies. Like, you ever see the scenes in Gringotts Bank? And they're like, I love the scenes in Gringotts Bank. He's like, do you know what those folks that run the bank are? And they're like, what? And they're like, Jews.
And then that, I remember. And then that person says, no, goblins. And then you go,
and you're like,
do you hear yourself?
Let me show you this from, it's the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I just want to show you a caricature. And they're like, oh, look at that. That's from Harry Potter. And you're like, no, that's a caricature of a Jew from an anti-Semitic piece of literature. J.K. Rowling was like, can we get these guys to run our bank? And you're like, it's a wizarding world. It's a world where it's
you can imagine anything.
The train station has a half a thing and no one can see it. And we can ride dragons and you've got a pet owl.
And who runs the bank?
Who should run the bank? Jews.
And not only
Like,
that,
no, it's.
I feel like she was like, why'd you make it so subtle?
It was one of those things where I saw it on the screen and I was expecting the crowd to be like, holy shit, she did not, in a wizarding world, just throw Jews in there to run the fucking underground bank. And everybody was just like, wizards.
Jon Stewart had a fair conversation about how the designs of the goblins in the Harry Potter films reflected very real anti-Semitic cartoons used as propaganda against Jewish folks during the Holocaust. Not only that, the usage of goblins in the Harry Potter books themselves as bankers hoarding over mounds of gold, miserly counting it regularly and refusing to give any of it to anyone, and obsessing over treasure and protecting it so vehemently that they will murder you for it, kind of reflects very real anti-Semitic stereotypes and harmful conspiracy theories of Jewish folks as miserly, obsessed with gold, and controlling over the wealth of the world as a secret cabal influencing culture. That's not true. That's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, but you can see how there's this connection between how the goblins are depicted as well as the image of them that reflects very real anti-Semitic images can be seen as offensive to Jewish people like Jon Stewart. And Jon Stewart's discussion is accurate on that very point. But instead of discussing that, instead of talking about how like, oh, there's these implicit themes in Harry Potter that could be read as offensive or have these undertones to it, instead of framing it that way, how did the news organizations and Twitter discourse take that discussion? Jon Stewart accuses J.K. Rowling of anti-Semitism! So yeah, the discourse quickly descended into hyperbolicism. Again, we see in this discourse that J.K. Rowling is either seen as an anti-Semitic Nazi, or she is a perfect saint, and how fucking dare Jon Stewart say anything about her character, about J.K. Rowling as a person, despite the fact that Jon Stewart never said anything about J.K. Rowling as a person, was only talking about her works of art. But again, we see how these things are intrinsically linked. Discussions of her work of art as anything less than perfect impugns on her character. And so Jon Stewart had to release this statement.
There is no reasonable person that could have watched it and not seen it as a light-hearted conversation amongst colleagues and chums, having a larf, enjoying ourselves about Harry Potter and my experience watching it for the first time in a theater as a Jewish guy, and how some tropes are so embedded in society that they're basically invisible, even in a considered process like movie making, right? It's trending on Twitter, and here's the headline from Newsweek. Jon Stewart accuses J.K. Rowling of anti-Semitism. So let me just say this, like super clearly as I can. I do not think J.K. Rowling is anti-Semitic. I did not accuse her of being anti-Semitic. I do not think that the Harry Potter movies are anti-Semitic. I really love the Harry Potter movies, probably too much for a gentleman of my considerable age. So I would just like to say that none of that is true, and not a reasonable person could not have looked at that conversation and not found it lighthearted. And now all the shitheads pile into this ridiculously out of context nonsense.
And in that statement, he made it very clear that he was talking about these issues being so ingrained in our culture that they can present themselves in works even subconsciously. How these stereotypes are still sadly deeply rooted in prejudices in our culture that need to be openly discussed. But all that got lost because the point that Jon Stewart had to make very clear was that he wasn't insulting poor J.K. Rowling. And so the needed and necessary conversation over the issues inherent in her work in Harry Potter got lost. And this has happened repeatedly over Rowling's work. It happened when people tried to discuss how tokenistic and post hoc her statement that Dumbledore was gay was, and her lack of actually making his homosexuality explicit in the text of the work made her statement feel performative and self-congratulatory. Stating that was seen as a direct attack on her goodness, and not the actual good faith criticism that it was meant to be. It happened when people discussed how her Asian character in Harry Potter, Cho Chang, was offensive because she felt like a stereotype, even down to the fact that her name is an amalgamation from two different Asian cultures, all ignored, downplayed, or seen as people calling out J.K. Rowling as a horrid person. And that just can't be true. Now, setting aside the transphobic elephant in the room and pretending it's not there for a moment, The issue isn't that Rowling is a good or bad person. It's like Jon Stewart said, it's discussing how these issues have become so ingrained in our culture, within filmmaking, within book writing, within fantasy, that they can perpetuate harmful stereotypes without them being a conscious choice by the creator, by someone like Rowling, but that we need to talk about them to help stop them, how they're reflective of these very supremacy narratives that J.K. Rowling herself was discussing in her work, how these supremacy narratives are not always explicit, but sometimes they're subtle and underneath the surface. Something that Harry Potter as a book series expressly talked about. How ideas that wizards are more important than goblins or house elves and things like that can be reflective of very real underground fascistic and supremacist undertones to a society. And so I find it very frustrating that we can't have that same type of conversation with J.K. Rowling about her work. When people criticize these works of art, we're not saying she's a bad person or that Harry Potter is a terrible work of art, but that they are works of art, both containing good and bad in equal measure, and that we can learn just as much from the bad as the good. But to do so, we need to talk about the bad, lest it get perpetuated. And perpetuated it was. When Rowling returned to Harry Potter with the Fantastic Beasts movies, because she was insulated from criticism that shielded her from critically analyzing her work, she perpetuated many of the same issues. Yet again, we see Dumbledore in the first 2 Fantastic Beasts movies just hinted at being gay rather than allowing for authentic and undeniable representation. Or how she culturally appropriated indigenous American cultures in her backstory for Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. Or issues with Asian representation of Nagini in Fantastic Beasts. Or how the Fantastic Beasts movies quite literally equated house elves with Black Americans. Which, given the implication throughout the Harry Potter series that house elves liked being enslaved, is deeply offensive in the implication. Because she was able to ignore all of those problems, she was perpetuating them in new works of this universe. And these stereotypes can enact harm in many ways, both directly and indirectly. I did a whole video about the anti-Asian racism directed at the actress who played Cho Chang in the Harry Potter movies that got ignored because to call it out would have ruined the reputation of Harry Potter and its fandom and J.K. Rowling herself. Something that we totally couldn't do. We can't ruin the reputation of the show. And so the actress faced hordes of racism in silence before she was even an adult. Or how indirectly these attitudes of things like LGBTQ folks not being undeniably present in a story hides us in society, allowing folks to justify us being ignored and shoved into the closet in real life. And those are 2 examples of many. Yet, even worse is the harm enacted upon those who tried to speak up about these issues. Because to criticize J.K. Rowling's work was equated to an attack on a worship figure. And so those who spoke up about these issues were not just seen as people speaking about these issues, but as antagonists. As villains in J.K. Rowling's story. As my wonderful fellow YouTuber and writer Princess Weeks wrote,
people of color have long talked about the issues in Harry Potter, but the fact that the series was anti-racist on some superficial level was always thrown against us, because very basic Hitler allegories are radical, apparently.
People had long been calling out J.K. Rowling's issues, and yet when they did, they were harassed, attacked, or dismissed and ignored as hateful. When all they were trying to do is have an honest conversation. It even happens on a less hyperbolic level too. Princess Weeks' words are something that I myself need to reflect on and hold myself accountable to. For years before J.K. Rowling's more overt transphobia, before I had been given the tools and education to truly understand how to separate the creator from art, to acknowledge that the things that I love can be flawed, I consistently defended Rowling. I defended her to my friends, to my family. I actively ignored or pushed back against many of the issues that we spoke about earlier, because I couldn't allow Harry Potter to possibly be imperfect in my mind. Because it was something that I loved and meant so much to me. I was never harassing, but I never allowed myself to truly see the criticism of the work that I held dear. And then also defending Rowling as a result. I stand her quite often. I was like, yes, she's this wonderful, virtuous person. And I ignored the criticism that many people were having. So I wanted to be clear, if you ignored the criticism of J.K. Rowling, I'm not saying you're a harasser and awful and abusive. What I'm saying is that maybe you put blinders up. Because I sure did. I didn't recognize it until it directly affected me. And that's my own fault. I could have done better to recognize the harm that was being done to others before it happened to me. Something I'm trying to get better today around other issues even outside of Rowling. But, speaking of that, let's talk about J.K. Rowling's transphobia. Yes, you knew we had to get there eventually. Now, I'm not going to go over why J.K. Rowling's words against the trans community have been harmful. I've done that in numerous videos before, so check them out if you want that commentary from me. But the issue is, here, again, we see Rowling's words being equated with her virtue. So despite her words being directly harmful to a community that is marginalized, the trans community, and because the trans community is currently so politicized that our very existence is seen as up for debate as to if we're even real people or not, and that we're already inherently cast as antagonists in many of this polarized political discourse, despite just trying to fight to define our lives and right to live happily and healthily and with basic human rights. To criticize J.K. Rowling's transphobia is not just discussing the harm her words have caused, but instead seen as an attack on a precious, perfect person. As a result, this dynamic paints any trans person who is trying to talk about the harm that J.K. Rowling's words has caused as aggressors, who are trying to attack and harm and hurt J.K. Rowling as a person. It's why whenever I talk about J.K. Rowling in a video, I have to make explicitly and very clear that I am not there to attack her as a person, but just to discuss the issues that she's brought up and continually brings up. Despite her being the one instigating the discourse every time, and believe me, it's not trans people who want to keep talking about J.K. Rowling, but J.K. Rowling who wants to be talking about trans people, we're cast as villains, despite the fact that we would rather not be talking about J.K. Rowling at all. And so that feeds into this already existing harmful narrative of trans people as predators, haters of women, somehow attacking women's rights by our very existence. All the while, Rowling, as is made clear by her Twitter feed, constantly gets to reinforce to herself that she is doing right and that continually attacking the trans community is not only acceptable, but virtuous because she's seen as a god. And then it starts to equate transphobia with being virtuous as well. Because if she's a virtuous, perfect person, then everything that she says is also virtuous and perfect. And so transphobia also gets to be seen as virtuous. And you can see how this connection not only enables harm in a personal place like Whedon did to the women and people around him, but how it can be used to further bigotry in the real world. How this veneration of a person can be used to perpetuate very deeply hurtful biases in everyday life.
Most people are broadly supporting of trans people, including JKR and Rosie Dunfield and most of the people who are gender critical. Being supportive doesn't mean allowing them to override women's rights, though. Women are entitled to safe spaces free of males, however they identify.
J.K. Rowling is not doing any of that, and neither are those who agree with her. Trans people are not being attacked. Women's rights are not transphobia.
There is no agenda against trans people. Speaking up in defense of the rights of women is not transphobia. J.K. Rowling's statements have always been considered and compassionate. The backlash against her reveals their aggressive, febrile misogyny that fuels extreme gender ideology.
And yet, also, I feel like I'd be missing a trick if I only talked about those who defended J.K. Rowling. Because while many still hold Rowling in that deified role, others cast her as the villain, as some sort of devil incarnate. Not only does this do what we saw with Whedon, which sort of loses the nuance of discussion and understanding that the harm that she is causing, perpetuating, comes from a very real human place and removes her agency in the matter, it also does something else. It enables those who are critical of Rowling to attack and harass her, to go after her as a person because they don't see her as a person. Rowling has constantly discussed how she has received death threats and harassment all the time. Now, to a degree, I understand emotionally why people are sending those things to her. She's enabling and mainstreaming real harmful narratives against trans people and attempting to influence legislation that directly targets trans rights. And so I understand that that is intensely traumatic to feel. I feel every day I see J.K. Rowling's name pop up in the news. I feel hurt and scared and harmed because of it. Especially so because she's so deified by certain aspects of our culture. Believe me, I've had very real panic attacks when I wake up and see J.K. Rowling trending for some other thing that she said about trans people and realizing that now I have to address it. I certainly love spending my time learning new ways that people can hate me. It's fun. Nah. But while I understand the emotion of it, it is not okay to harass her, even if it comes from an understandable place of emotion. Yet some see it as acceptable to threaten and harass her because to them, she's not a person. She's a symbol of hate. And so this entire dynamic creates a feedback loop, where not only does Rowling get to reinforce herself as virtuous from her defenders, but because humans only see the extremes, she looks at the death threats from those who oppose her. She's then allowed to cast herself as the hero and all those who criticize her as the villains because she's only seeing the most hyperbolic form of the people who criticize her, who are clearly crossing a line. And because of that, there is nary a moment of introspection and self-analysis of the harm that she herself has perpetuated, because there's never a challenge to her internalized narrative. And same to the people who defend her, because their narrative is never challenged, they don't ever have to question themselves. And the harm can get perpetuated because they're seen as virtuous. And so the harm continues, and those who see it will reinforce their narrative of trans people as the villains, and so goes the feedback loop of hyperbolicized antagonistic discussion. Even further, I see this situation being used by more active, bigoted transphobes to mainstream and mask their transphobia. I've seen very clearly on Twitter, on my own comments, and elsewhere, people using the phrase, "I stand with J.K. Rowling," as a preface to then state their transphobia. And then if someone calls them out on that or points out their transphobia, they equate us with saying as if we're attacking J.K. Rowling and that we're a horrible person for attacking a woman. And can't we just listen to her point of view? This antagonistic situation being used to obfuscate mainstream and have plausible deniability in perpetuating hate.
Take, for example, how prominent anti-transgender campaigner and TERF Kelly J. Keane Minshall put up billboards around the UK that say, "I heart J.K. Rowling," alongside woman, adult, human, female signs. The words "I heart J.K. Rowling" are not there just to show support for J.K. Rowling in the abstract, but are in an important context after J.K. Rowling came out with her anti-transgender views. So to put up these billboards, combined with Rowling's harm to the trans community, as well as knowing who Kelly J. Keane Minshall is, it's clearly meant to be an attack on trans people and to make trans folks feel unwelcome in public spaces near these billboards. Yet these billboards are given the veneer of acceptability because they are hidden behind Rowling's perceived virtuousness. The words "I heart J.K. Rowling" have become sadly synonymous with anti-trans bigotry. I'm not saying that if you support J.K. Rowling, you're automatically an anti-trans bigot. I'm just saying that these words have been used to hide that exact form of transphobia.
This is not just exclusive to Rowling. I saw similar things happen with Dave Chappelle after his recent controversy over his special, The Closer. And it's not exactly new or unique to the trans community either. Numerous other marginalized groups have seen this happen over the years, where the defense of a singular person, such as, let's say, a politician who gets elected to a high office, is used to mask more overt bigotry. But then, going back to Rowling, to use her as the specific example of this dynamic, people who do defend Rowling but aren't as overtly transphobic get immediately defensive when I point this out. They say, well, that's not me. I may support J.K. Rowling, but I'm not transphobic, so how dare you call me transphobic? And so they push back against trans people like myself when we state that this does happen, instead of recognizing that maybe we're not directly talking about you, but about the situation and the people in that group. And maybe instead of pushing back against trans people or our allies because you don't want to be introspective of your place in this dynamic, maybe stop and take a look and see what these words are being used for and to mask. And in the end, all that happens is that one woman still receives constant harassment, while she simultaneously perpetuates harm against an entire marginalized community. No one wins. And yet, Rowling gets to keep making more work, holding onto her platform, and keep perpetuating the harm. And also, on a much less important level, it just allows her work to continue to be shit. Like, I know this isn't the most important thing at the end of the day, but like, dear God, I wish J.K. Rowling would allow herself to hear fucking criticism of her Fantastic Beasts movies, because maybe then the third one that's about to come out would actually be a good movie instead of the inevitable pile of garbage that we all know it's going to be. So, we're not even getting good art out of this fucking deal. This brings us back to Whedon though, because I skipped over a part of his story. The part that we're now at with Rowling today. Today, the prevailing feeling on Whedon is that he's bad, actually. But to get there required a lot of harm. From what I can tell, Ray Fisher's career is deeply halted because he had to call out Joss Whedon. Who knows what films Ray Fisher would have been able to do if he hadn't had to take on Warner Brothers. He's much less likely to be hired by the big studio industries in Hollywood because he was seen as rocking the boat. If Whedon hadn't done the harmful things that he did and Ray Fisher just got to have a fine experience on the movie, his career would be in a much better place now.
Though thankfully, as I was editing this video, it was announced that Ray Fisher will be cast in a movie being directed by Zack Snyder, showing how the original director of Justice League is still standing by his star, at least.
Beyond that, though, Carpenter, Kai Cole, Gal Gadot, and others all received harassment for their words calling out Whedon, as did Ray Fisher.
It also ignores that often those who are harmed by these actions from these creators are often from marginalized groups. While Whedon and Rowling have no doubt received harassment and threats, which they shouldn't have to, they also complain about these threats while ignoring that women, prominent people of color, trans folks, and more often receive the same harassment for just existing publicly. Take how Harry Potter actress Katie Leung or Star Wars actress Kelly Marie Tran were harassed for just being in big movies, or how recently a trans woman who won on Jeopardy got a ton of harassment for just being a trans woman on Jeopardy as well. So while Whedon and Rowling shouldn't get harassed, they get that because of their actions. While many marginalized folks get harassment just in general for existing, and when they enter into these situations to just discuss it, often receive an overwhelmingly greater amount of harassment despite being at a much smaller scale of awareness than those who are perpetuating the harm in the first place. And so we see how this whole dynamic perpetuates harm even as it's ongoing. But even further, speaking on that, we can also see how Whedon's actions are also reflective of something else. Not only the entitlement that he was told to have as an individual who was venerated as a god for creating Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but also the entitlement that he was told to have as a person with a certain identity in our society. I know some of you are going to get defensive on this, but it's very important to point out that this entitlement that he felt is reflective of how many cis white men are told to feel entitled to other people and other identities and cultures. For example, Whedon felt entitled to women's bodies, that women were there for him to use. We can also see casual racism in his depiction of Gal Gadot's version of events on Justice League. When refuting Gal Gadot's allegations that he threatened her career, Whedon stated,
"English is not her first language, and I tend to be annoyingly flowery in my speech."
Not only did he subtly compliment himself with his flowery speech line, but he also belittled Gadot's intelligence due to her ethnicity. Gadot herself stated that she understood perfectly. Even beyond Gadot, though, Whedon addressed Ray Fisher's claims by stating,
"We're talking about a malevolent force. We're talking about a bad actor, in both senses."
Yeah. So instead of reflecting on what Fisher was feeling and his real concerns as both a young actor with a career ahead of him and as a black man trying to represent his community, Whedon instead cast Fisher as the villain, and himself as the hero, and he did so by insulting the man and questioning his motivations. So women he belittles, infantilized, saying they just couldn't understand or that he had to use their bodies, playing into those senses of entitlement. But a black man, well, he was aggressive, malevolent, angry for no reason, and sucked as an actor too, which, by the way, is also completely unwarranted and objectively untrue. I'm not a fan of the Snyder Cut, but Ray Fisher did a great job in that version of the movie. But more importantly, it's important to recognize that Joss Whedon has just cast Ray Fisher into that stereotype of a black man as malicious, aggressive, and harmful. It's also perhaps telling that while many women on the sets of pretty much every Whedon production, from Buffy and Angel with Charisma Carpenter and Sarah Michelle Gellar, to Dollhouse with Eliza Dushku, to Justice League with Gal Gadot, speak about their toxic and difficult experiences with Whedon, while the men, and more often white men around Whedon, have actively stated how they didn't encounter the same experience. Firefly and Dollhouse star Alan Tudyk tweeted,
"Wasn't there, but I have known Joss for 17 years. I honestly can't even imagine it, and I have a pretty good imagination."
Even James Marsters, who I spoke about earlier with his experience with Whedon, seemed to soften his words against Whedon after Charisma Carpenter's allegations.
In Joss's world, evil is not cool, and I really respect him for that. Vampires were just a metaphor for the challenges that you get over in your adolescence. So vampires are supposed to be overcome. And he got talked into one sexy vampire that's not going to be killed off. That was Angel. And I was supposed to come in and get killed off. And the audience immediately reacted to me in a way that made it, was going to make it very difficult to kill me off. And the network was telling them, "Oh my God, keep this guy in the show," and all of that. And he's like, I was basically ruining his show.
Basically forcing him to keep you on because you were doing so well.
Yes, but the thing is that that is going to change the show from being about a teenager overcoming adolescence into a show where those problems are kind of sexy, aren't they? All those.
While Marsters overall has stood by Carpenter, and Alan Tudyk did kind of half apologize for a statement denying Charisma's experience, I think what this illustrates to me more is how men around Whedon were not treated this way on a regular basis, and didn't face the same environment of harassment as women and people of color did.
Marsters certainly was treated badly one time, but from what we can tell, it was not a repeated behavior, but a single incident. Speaking to this same underlying bias that Whedon did not feel the same liberty with white men around him that he did with other identities. This isn't saying all cis white men are bad, it's just saying that those identities are often taught by this society that they are owed certain things, that they are entitled to certain things. And so, to cap out this section, while I've been speaking to how Whedon's deification as a creator and individual enabled his entitlement, I can't just chalk all of this up to that. Because it's reflective of how many white men are made to feel entitled to all others in the world today. And I'm not casting cis white men as villains, nor am I saying every cis white man is a horrible person. That would kind of defeat my whole kind of point and argument here. But what I am saying is that society does tell men like Whedon that everyone around them is there for their story. Women are there to be earned. People from other cultures just don't get yours, and that you can use theirs, but they don't get to use yours. Or black men are antagonists in your story. They're villains in your story. It's the story of how our society builds itself today. White, cis, straight men as the protagonists and others as subordinates, possibly antagonists, side characters, or love interests, instead of being people unto themselves. It's ultimately sad because you'd think a man who put a woman as the protagonist of his story would recognize that maybe he might not be the center of his. But when we're told a good story over and over and over again, even if that story is fictional, we sometimes tend to believe it and instill it into our identity. So, to be honest with all of you, I'm filming this part of the video after I already filmed and started editing the rest of the video, because I realized as I shot it, and due to some events that occurred while I was filming this, that there was a little bit more that I missed and wanted to discuss with this topic. Also, I kind of wanted an excuse to wear this vest that I purchased because I want to become a vest person now, and I think I look really good in vests. But of course, that is the most important discourse that I want to come out of this video. Do you think I'm a vest person? Let that be the discourse that happens here. Obviously, I'm kind of joking, but seriously, a couple things that I wish to add to this discussion. Firstly, let's stay on the larger creator level, like the big names in this field, because this whole narrative that I've been discussing, this aggrandizement of creators that creates this binarized discourse, is an understood dynamic that sometimes happens based off of the actions of creators independent of the dynamic, but it's also one that some take advantage of. I mean, it's by no means new in politics, as I alluded to earlier, where politicians often aggrandize and make themselves into symbols and stoke this us versus them narrative in order to build enthusiasm for themselves and their platform, and creating a feeling from their followers that shields them from criticism, and saying everyone that disagrees with them is the enemy, is the person to hate. And this is often done at the expense or utilizing marginalized community, but that's a very commonly known idea in politics. But even if we stay in the creative space, we saw a similar thing happen with Dave Chappelle last year with trans people. I did a whole video where I discussed the nuances of the issue with Dave Chappelle's movie, The Closer, and how I actually thought that while I found a lot of that special offensive specifically to trans people and how he framed the discussion, that he did have a lot of salient points to say as well, that there was a conversation to talk about the good and bad in that special, even though overall I found it to be intensely hurtful and problematic to the trans community. But since I released that video, and while I do think there is nuance to the discussion around what Chappelle was saying that I encourage you to find in my original video, what has concerned me deeply about Chappelle's response afterwards to this controversy is how he's used this canceling narrative around him to build up support for himself. Like, for example, how he used the situation to direct people who were trying to defend him to go see his upcoming movie.
I desperately want people to see this movie. But I understand why investors would be nervous. Since nobody will touch it, I'll tell you what I'll do. I will make it available for all of you in 10 American cities, going on sale in the next few days. You will be able to see this movie in its entirety, and you can see what they're trying to obstruct you from seeing. And you can judge for yourself, but you cannot have this conversation and exclude my voice from it. That is only fair.
This movie had nothing to do with why he was canceled. I mean, I'm sure it's a fine film, but what irks me most is how he used this conversation and this narrative and dynamic that had started to be built up around him, and instead of shifting the conversation to where it really needed to be, even though he paid lip service to doing that, he actually instead used it to build up support for himself and his content in a completely separate field. Certainly, yes, his controversy split his audience, but the audience that sided with him, that deified him and viewed him as a goat, as they often say in his defense, are now more attached to him than ever before, than even before he came out with the closure special. And Chappelle probably has seen the biggest success he's had in years and relevancy that he's had in years from the situation. So while he gets aggrandized and he gets to benefit from it, the nuanced conversation that should be having around trans people and discussions are lost. Most trans people, myself included, weren't calling for his cancellation, but an honest discussion about how trans people are represented, both behind the screen and in front of it, and in companies like Netflix, as well as how we need to make sure that we don't erase and ignore that trans people of color actually exist. But all that got lost in this discussion with just it being framed as trans people are trying to cancel Chappelle. And again, because that sort of antagonistic narrative was created, attacks and harms against the trans community got perpetuated. I myself got a lot of harassment from very dark groups because of my videos on Dave Chappelle. And these people start to see themselves as morally justified as the actual issues that many hope to get addressed are ignored. And while we can't really know if Dave Chappelle intended for this to happen or not, we can only know how he wielded it after the fact, we do see comedians like Ricky Gervais saying that he's going to attempt to get canceled with his next special, because he realizes that canceling is actually good for business.
And I'll bet you $10 right here, right now, that the way that Ricky Gervais attempts to get canceled in his latest special is by insulting some marginalized group, probably trans people.
Certainly, it pushes you into nicher audiences with less widespread appeal, but those niche markets are more enthusiastic about you than a broader appeal ever would have been. We see that, for example, with someone like Gina Carano, who got fired from the Star Wars series, which was a broad appeal franchise that got her a lot of attention, but when she was fired from that series for her words about trans people, she was then hired by the right-wing Daily Wire company run by Ben Shapiro, where she now has a more ardent fan base than ever. You can even see that in the fact that her name was literally trending on Twitter just the day that I recorded this, the first day of February.
When Whoopi Goldberg was recently suspended from The View for her words on the Holocaust, causing people to compare Goldberg and Gina Carano. It showcased people again falling into this antagonistic, politicized, binarized discourse, arguing that Whoopi had some sort of liberal privilege for only getting suspended from The View, and Gina Carano was fired for quote-unquote being conservative in their eyes, without these people recognizing the differences in the discussion between Whoopi and Carano, how Gina Carano was repeatedly given numerous chances but doubled down on her issues, and how regardless, she's still doing fine with Ben Shapiro right now.
And what this does is create more bubbles of insularity while harm gets perpetuated and necessary conversations that would actually build constructive bridges get ignored or even actively vilified. For example, to even talk about trans people needing to be heard on issues surrounding Dave Chappelle has now become a polarized topic in and of itself, when in reality, hearing from people who are being discussed on a matter should kind of be, the norm. You shouldn't talk about people without people. Not to mention, as I said before, the consistent erasure of trans women of color, as we saw with most of the trans women being discussed when it came to Dave Chappelle.
Even further, these niche platforms then isolate people and push them further into their views, denying them the chance to, as we've talked about before, be truly exposed to the harm of their actions. Just have their fans in these niche bubbles reinforce their effects and their words as virtuous. That's what happened with Gina Carano and how J.K. Rowling has been pushed further into the TERF community. Additionally, like Dave Chappelle, we see grifters actively trying to use events where they aren't even really canceled to give the appearance of such, saying they're being silenced in order to sell tickets. See how in this tweet, Matt Walsh, a right-wing commentator who has recently targeted the trans community numerous times, as I've spoken about in a recent video, uses the fact that trans people are protesting his upcoming event to sell tickets to that event, saying he's being silenced by the dangerous transes, despite the fact that, he has an event that he's speaking at and selling tickets to. These cancellation narratives can even be wielded against others for personal gain. Take how the current ongoing conversation surrounding Spotify and Joe Rogan about how Joe Rogan platforms vaccine misinformation and said the N-word years ago didn't start specifically because Rogan did those things, but because Neil Young made an announcement that he was leaving Spotify because of them, which then caused his streaming numbers off of Spotify to soar to new heights and eventually settle to his normal amounts,
but now, without Spotify, to have to be paid to for him to get those numbers. He wielded this controversy and personally gained from it because people saw him as making a virtuous stand while vilifying Joe Rogan. And look, I'm not saying that he was wrong or that I don't think Rogan shouldn't be called out for these things. I'm just pointing out how this type of saint and sinner dynamic within cancel culture narratives can be wielded, both by the person being canceled or by others to boost themselves up into nicher audiences. Further, we can also see how situations like these also cause fallout on associates of those who are causing harm in the first place as well. A good example of this can be seen with Dave Chappelle. For one, often there can be people who are associates with these people who cause harm who use their platform to help minimize and ignore those who are harmed by these people by just saying that their friends are just good people. Jon Stewart did this, for example, by ignoring the criticism of trans people against Dave Chappelle after The Closer, saying Dave Chappelle was just a good guy, ignoring and not centralizing the voices of those most harmed. Yet conversely, we also see people who are just casual friends or even just mild professional associates who are not endorsing anyone's words receive harassment too. Comedian Patton Oswalt, who has by no means been perfect but has steadfastly listened to and supported trans people, received harassment and callouts for posting a picture with Dave Chappelle around Christmas of 2021, causing Oswalt immediately to have to state his support of trans people and his disappointment with Chappelle's words. And Oswalt's words were illuminating in this situation.
But we also 100% disagree about transgender rights and representation. I support trans people's rights, anyone's rights, to live safely in the world as their fullest selves. For all the things he's helped me evolve on, I'll always disagree with where he stands now on transgender issues. But I also don't believe a seeker like him is done evolving, learning. You know someone that long, see the struggles and changes, it's impossible to cut them off. Impossible not to be hopeful and open and cheer them on. Also, I've been carrying a lot of guilt about friends I've cut off, who had views with which I couldn't agree or changed in ways I couldn't live with. Sometimes I wonder, did I and others cutting them off make them dig their heels in deeper, fuel their ignorance with a nitro boost of resentment and spite? I'm an LGBTQ ally, I'm a loyal friend. There's friction in those traits that I need to reconcile myself and not let cause feels of betrayal in anyone else. And I'm sorry, truly sorry that I didn't consider the hurt this would cause, or the depth of that hurt. I've been messaging a lot on Instagram today, and the back and forth has really helped guide me in the writing of this. I, naively, deleted a lot of posts in the comment thread, critical ones from LGBTQ writers and shit posts by TERF/anti-trans orcs looking for clicks and giggles. I wanted a nice comment thread about the pic with my friend. Ugh, so easy to think someone else needs growth and miss the need in yourself. Gonna keep trying.
Oswald's words showcase the feelings of a man who are deeply conflicted, and the often precarious and uncertain place with those who associate with those who have caused harm are placed into, how unsure they are of how to proceed, something I'll talk more about in a moment on a more personal level. So there's all of that, but that's still top level because I want to get even grayer here, because I think it's also important to note this dynamic of harm being inflicted upon more marginalized groups also gets reflected in those who are being deified or vilified or canceled. Whedon may be deified, but as the Undoing of Whedon article discusses, he still lives in a mansion with his 20-something-year-old wife. Similarly, while I do think J.K. Rowling faces a lot of extra harassment and scrutiny because she is a woman, she's also insulated by her wealth and amount of fame. Yet when we look at creators with less established platforms that are also less financially stable who are also from marginalized groups, they suffer much more scrutiny and higher standards placed upon them, and are much more likely to suffer both personal and professional consequences. For example, we could talk about the black trans woman who led the protest against Dave Chappelle at Netflix. It came out after the fact that she had a lot of tweets that were very, very racist towards Asian people, and I'm not here to erase the fact that people were very upset about that, as well they should have been.
At the height of my meth addiction, 8-9 years ago, I made a series of racially insensitive and homophobic tweets. I wasn't out yet and was dealing with internalized transphobia while homeless in a neighborhood where I felt culturally inferior. I'd stay up for days on end, tweeting from an impaired consciousness while shadowboxing via tweet with anyone who made me feel less than. Although those tweets were resurfaced as a political play, I take full responsibility for my actions and deeply apologize to those indirectly impacted by these developments. At over 7.5 years clean and sober, I've learned to make amends when I'm wrong and to take complete accountability for my actions. My life in recovery has been a living amends in and of itself, and I fully intend to keep fighting on the front line for the rights of all marginalized people. While I deeply regret the past, it's a poignant reminder of how far I've come in my healing, growth, and personal development, and why maintaining my recovery is of the utmost importance.
So as we can see, there's a lot more to that discussion and that topic when it came to her. It's also incredibly telling the fact that she is a black trans woman who also went through a lot of this marginalization, and at the same time that caused her to stoke other more racially motivated and biased thoughts in her. And we see how this cycle perpetuates itself and how it constantly falls upon marginalized people in these situations. And it showcases how people like black trans women of color are simultaneously held to higher standards of behavior while also treated worse by society. And it also doesn't negate the fact that her words about Dave Chappelle and Netflix and trans people within that were actually still salient points regardless of who she was. Now, we could talk about whether or not she should have been the one at the head of this movement, nor am I here to tell people who were offended by her tweets that they shouldn't be offended. You have every right to make that consideration for yourself. What I am saying, though, is that most of the conversation around her was white dudes vilifying her and then therefore vilifying her points of view about trans people when it came to Dave Chappelle and Netflix, and therefore I just dismissing the entire argument wholesale, just vilifying her and therefore vilifying the actual important conversation that needed to be had.
Well. Hope you're all having a wonderful Saturday, as some old tweets for Ashley Marie Preston, the superstar behind the Netflix walkout, you know, these things, these activists and so on and so forth. In my experience, they always have skeletons.
And as a result, despite there being a lot of attention directed towards it, there was nothing done from the Netflix protest. Also, I think it's incredibly worthwhile to note how Ashley Marie Preston responded to all of this, because I think her words are deeply insightful.
And I think that that's what kills y'all, because you operate from this place of of knee-jerk reaction. That, you know, this idea that, oh, like, if you're not perfect, then you're flawed, and then therefore you're a fraud, and you're a hypocrite, and you're all those things. That does not make me a hypocrite because I have a past. That just means I understood the assignment. The assignment is, when you fuck up, you fix it. The assignment is, you know, when you create harm, you make an amends and you repair that harm. The assignment is you talk about what you learned in your experiences and you share it with someone else, which is why when it comes to Dave Chappelle, which is what y'all are really mad about, who else better to speak about it and to him than me? The reason why I have the power, authority, and clearance to talk about accountability the way I do is because it's been a solid part of my own journey. So you don't have the power to put me in timeout when you're not even capable of taking time out to interrogate your own complicity in hate economics and the ways in which you continue to help this culture of violence thrive. So don't come to me with no silly stuff unless you're ready to heal together. And that's the reason why I'm not going anywhere, darling. I'm just getting started.
It's words and events like those around Ashley Marie Preston that also highlight a distinct difference between Whedon, Rowling, Chappelle, and her. An earnest desire to take accountability, acknowledge harm, and attempt to move forward while centralizing those you hurt. Which you don't see with these other creators that we've been talking about, because they aren't forced to reconcile with the harm they have caused because they remain insulated from it by those proclaiming their virtue, who refuse to allow them to see themselves as messy human beings who can be both harmful and helpful in different places. But we can also talk about how this dynamic affects people personally. For example, while I'm not comparing J.K. Rowling or Joss Whedon's actions to her actions, Lindsay Ellis, a well-known YouTuber who was similarly praised and upheld in this space, faced a controversy where she was also either ardently defended or abjectly vilified. Again, the situations behind this were different, but the dynamic of her canceling was very similar. During this, though, she was ultimately harassed horribly during her own similar controversy, to the point where she openly spoke about suffering and experiencing real trauma as a result.
2021 has been the worst year of my life. I am traumatized by it. To this day, I still have people scolding me by how I handled it, that I should have handled it differently, that I should have controlled my stands, as if I had the capability to know what any of these people were even saying to strangers on Twitter while I was shitting blood for weeks on end. The worst thing about this whole year is that I can't even admit this trauma because of all the rhetorical devices people have already come up with to dismiss it. That centering my own pain is evidence of me not listening. Does it occur to these people that you can listen and disagree with other people's conclusions? That I'm weaponizing my fragile white womanhood or whatever to point out that having thousands upon thousands of people who you have never met hate you and say whatever will get them the most updates about it is, in fact, traumatizing. That people I used to know would fragrantly lie about me on twitter.com to the tune of thousands of retweets and tens of thousands of likes, and I just had to sit there and take it. My favorite are people who dismiss any potential harm I might have incurred as justified because I am a wealthy white woman. I am not wealthy.
She also spoke about how her finances for both her and those who she paid was affected. While Whedon and Rowling can ignore the criticisms because they're insulated from them, some folks with less ability don't get that luxury. This isn't to say that these creators wouldn't listen to criticism, but it also opens them up to face much more direct harm by those who take it too far, who are fitting into this hyperbolicized narrative. They open themselves up to active harassment because they're trying to listen. Additionally, this dynamic also showcases how out of proportion these debates can go. Lindsay Ellis definitely made some mistakes, and we can certainly discuss the specifics of that elsewhere. And again, I'm not meaning to dismiss or downplay any of that, and I've talked about that in my own video on that topic. But also, her mistakes, to my mind, weren't anywhere near the level of repeated harm that someone like J.K. Rowling does, and for which Rowling never even has to take a smidge of accounting for. And yet Ellis, I think, received much the same level of vitriol as Rowling did, and suffered, as she stated in her letter, very real trauma as a result. Yet, when this ability for those with certain privileged identities or positions of power or more to survive fairly comfortably while being cancelled is called out, people again get defensive. In Lindsay Ellis's letter stating that she was leaving YouTube for good, she stated, quote,
"The good, progressive, cis, straight, wealthy white men keep on trucking and coming out on top because deep down, they know that the system they profess to stand against ultimately exists to benefit them."
And, she's not wrong in that at all. But I saw so many people, when discussing Lindsay's letter in my own video and on Twitter and things like that, who would say, well, I'm supportive of Lindsay, but why did she have to attack white men at the end of the letter? Really crappy of her. And I can't help but feel that it's the same defensiveness that I was talking about when we were discussing J.K. Rowling. Lindsay at that moment wasn't attacking every single white dude. What she was doing was pointing out how this canceling dynamic greatly affected her mental health, her livelihood, and her ability to feel safe and secure financially and personally. While at the same time, many other men who go through the same thing will often end up fine on the other side of events like this. This isn't to say that no man has ever faced that there haven't been men who have been canceled and also faced trauma like Lindsay, but that there is a trend of men being able to survive or ignore events like this, both because they were already financially stable and firmly established beforehand and could ignore the attacks, or because they just doubled down on their horrible actions and survived fine, or people were just generally more inclined, whether they were conscious of it or not, to give these men more grace to be messy, to make mistakes, to get forgiveness, to earn that forgiveness, or to make the same mistakes again. I mean, look at the recent controversy surrounding Joe Rogan and Spotify to see how, because of Rogan's popularity and financial benefit to Spotify, his platform has never really been in danger. Not to mention the myriad of people who say even worse things, but because of the communities they frequent, will never have to face any criticism whatsoever that they have to care about. I mean, look at folks like Ben Shapiro or Tucker Carlson, who will say really vile things every single day, and there's almost no question that their platform will be taken away from them. And again, I ask you, if you feel defensive when Lindsay Ellis says that sort of thing, or when I say that sort of thing, I would just ask you to analyze why you're feeling that way. That's not to say you can't say that I'm wrong. I would also just ask you, though, to just take a minute of introspection before you think about that, before you say that. Just to sort of say, like, well, why am I feeling that way? Because I feel like, to me, Lindsay wasn't talking about every single cis white dude ever, wasn't attacking all white men, but was talking about this dynamic that many white men will often be allowed to survive events like this, where many women are most likely not to. This isn't to say there aren't exceptions either way, but that is generally the case that we see happening. So all of that's some stuff that I wish to add to this video on sort of a larger level. But it would be remiss of me to not talk about this when it comes to myself. So, quite coincidentally, I myself got tangentially embroiled in this very dynamic that we've been discussing as I was making this video. After I had filmed the other parts of this video, an issue occurred surrounding a creator from the Twitch sphere, who I'm not going to name or gender here because I want this discussion to not be a defense or condemnation of this person, because I'm not planning on doing either here, but to focus on the dynamics at play that we've been discussing. That being said, if you do want to see who I'm talking about, I've discussed who in my community tab, so I'm not trying to hide it, I just want to keep the focus here in this video. However, going back to this topic, I first encountered this streamer back when they streamed one of my videos on their Twitch channel. And from there, we had a few discussions within their live chat. I was in the chat and they were, talking to me on their Twitch channel. From there, I had been invited onto a charity live stream on their channel where they helped raise money for trans people, and ultimately I also asked them to do some minor voiceover work in a couple of my videos reading some quotes. Sort of the typical thing that YouTubers often do. So I don't know them super well, but we've been in each other's content and they've been very nice and supportive to me professionally and personally overall, and from what I saw, to trans people in general. However, that being said, the day before I actually filmed the last part of this video, this creator posted a tweet that was honestly offensive and transphobic that, from what I can tell, unintentionally, but directly, evoked similar talking points as transphobic TERF narratives around trans people. Even further, the tweet, like Dave Chappelle did for his content on trans people, ignored the existence of trans women of color, framing the discussion of the trans community solely through the prism of white trans folks, perpetuating the erasure of some of the most vulnerable members of the LGBTQ community. And as a result, this tweet got a ton of criticism for very understandable reasons. Like many trans folks, for me personally, I was bothered and offended by the tweet as a trans person. And from there, some others from other communities, like communities of color, also took issue with the tweet, again for very understandable reasons. Further, while I didn't know about this until after the tweet happened, this creator had a problematic history surrounding many issues regarding race, gender, and more. So after this happened, the creator deleted the tweet, apologized for it, and spoke offline and publicly with several trans people. And while they were doing so, they made sure to center the criticism in the discussion, not their own feelings on the event. It acknowledged what they had said was wrong, and, as for the prior behavior that I mentioned, had before this incident also acknowledged and apologized for it in a similar way, and to my awareness at this moment hadn't had a ton of incidents like that within the past few years. Especially considering that part of the reason that a lot of those things had happened before were before that she actually came out and realized that she needed to change her ways. So all this had happened, and the apology happened on the day that I was filming the last part of this video. And before I was even aware of any of this happening, because again, I was filming that day, I got several messages and comments from folks asking me to make a statement due to my associations with this creator. Most of those comments and messages were heated, asking me to call this creator out and vehemently demanding that I make some sort of statement. And as a result, because I also saw a few other creators also responding to this, I felt compelled to respond to an incident I didn't have anything to do with because I had been associated with this person prior. And so I responded, and you can read my statement in full on my community tab if you wish. But the long and short of it was that I personally found the tweet offensive. I understood why people were upset because I too am upset and totally understood if people didn't wish to watch this creator anymore. And if they were upset that I had worked with this creator before this incident had happened, well, I understood that too. Even further, I can't speak for communities that I'm not a part of, nor can I speak for the entire trans community. So I'm not here to belittle or dismiss criticisms coming from other trans people or communities of color or other communities about this action or prior ones. So, speaking only for myself, while I was hurt and offended by the tweet, what I saw after that was someone who apologized, and while I learned after I issued the statement about some of the specifics about their past, I also saw that she was someone who was actively trying to move past this and all of that and learn and grow from there. And I had seen them doing good in trying to fight for and alongside trans people in other communities both before and after this, such as the aforementioned charity stream that I was on. So while I will be very hesitant to have them in my content moving forward and will certainly be more critical of them regardless and haven't fully forgiven them yet, I personally choose to give them the chance to earn that forgiveness, for me to forgive them. That the fact that they had already shown an active desire to take accountability, to listen to voices not their own, and to make amends, something I don't see in J.K. Rowling, Whedon, or Dave Chappelle, or being realistic, other creators on this level in these situations, for me, that was the biggest difference. That they were actively participating in a process of earning forgiveness. That's what my statement was, and that's where I sat at the time that I made it. From there, this situation until this point, and the response after it, was educational and illuminating for me. First, I started to analyze my feeling of how I felt compelled to respond to a situation that I was not involved in due to minor association with this person. I also noticed how most of the discourse around this person after this tweet, at least the most prominent of which, was that they were either not a good person and had malicious intent, or that the tweet was fine, people were misinterpreting it, and that a lot of people were overreacting to it. What saddened me most was how that created that hyperbolic antagonistic fighting that we've been talking about this entire video. I even saw it in responses to my response to the incident. And I get that it was heated. This is a sensitive issue. I'm not saying that people were wrong to not be emotionally upset or anything like that. I was just saddened that I saw that hyperbolicism and fighting here too. People attacking each other and defending or attacking this creator in equal measure. I'm not hitting on anyone or telling anyone that they were specifically wrong because, as we've been discussing, it's a legitimate emotional reaction people were having about a very real and sensitive topic. But the conversation, to me, at least the overriding one, the biggest and loudest voices that came out of that for people, wasn't constructive. And it was people talking at each other, not with each other. Talking at this creator or at me, not with me or this creator. And as I said, it made me deeply sad. And separately, deeply anxious. I spent the entire day after I posted that response in the morning deeply worried and anxious and upset and trying to analyze my feelings and just going through it all. Even though I had put out a statement, I was there refreshing the comments, trying to listen to what people had to say and reading all this stuff, every single one, and I got scared of all the anger that was there and worried that my response had hurt people or that I ignored someone who I shouldn't have, or I had centralized the wrong points, or I had made the wrong statement. All of this stuff was swirling in my mind. And in the comments, rightfully so, there were people responding to my response. But there were people who were angry with me, who stated that they wanted to unsubscribe because of the incident, because they saw me as actively hurting people with my statement, that I was making excuses for this person and for myself for associating with them. Yet conversely, I also saw people praising me for being nuanced and thoughtful, and what an excellent statement that I had made, how wonderfully thoughtful I had been. I saw both in equal measure, and both responses made me anxious, because I hadn't felt I had made a good statement at all. I just made a statement about how I felt at the moment that I was making it, even though I was changing that thought process as I was going through the day. How I was trying to wrestle with my own sense of being upset, but also wanted to be constructive in a way I always talk about in all of my videos. I don't want hate for that, but neither do I want praise. I don't know. I don't want anything. I just wanted to be honest, because I was wrestling with my feelings on it. But I also knew that I had to say something, even though I was trying to, after the fact, figure out what I was feeling and how best to proceed even after I made a statement. It also made me reflect on how people often expect creators to have instant and fully formed opinions about stuff that just happened and about stuff that is emotionally turmoiling for them. And that statements that creators make are seen by their audience as definitive and fully immovable, as if they didn't come after hours of anxiety and worry and aren't preceded by even more anxiety and worry and self-doubt afterwards. How I'm constantly trying to question and consider how I'm reacting and dealing with these situations as I'm taking part of them. How even now, this part of the video that you're watching right now, I've thought over and gone over 50 billion times about how I wanted to talk about this incident, how I'm questioning it right now as I'm talking to you, and how I'm probably going to question it 50 million more times as I edit this, or that my intent was not to ignore or hurt someone at the expense of someone else.
Yeah, even amid all of this and thinking all of this, there's a part of me that also reflects on words like Patton Oswalt when he was talking about Dave Chappelle. Or the words that Lindsay Ellis said when she spoke about how a lot of her friends abandoned her when she was canceled during her own controversy, and how she felt alone because of it.
I regret every time I have ever tried to play the game with peers and colleagues. They will drop you in a second you aren't popular on Twitter anymore. It's all hollow and brittle, and if there is one thing I have learned this year, it is how eminently expendable I am.
Do I want to be that person that does that to people around me? But I also don't want to ignore the people who were more harmed as well. I'm left deeply, deeply conflicted in all of this.
But I also don't want that to sound like an excuse, because this incident also made me reflect on how I also need to know that my statements do matter to people who follow me, to people in my audience, to people who encounter me. How my words, even if unintentionally, can ignore people, can hurt people, even if that's not my intention. In fact, it's my biggest worry and most constant fear. But it would be naive of me to think I can somehow craft the perfect statement for everyone in a situation that I'm still juggling with myself. So, how do I reconcile all of that? How do I be an imperfect human when I'm expected to be perfect, not just by my audience, but, and honestly, this was most shocking to me as I self-analyzed, but expected to be perfect by myself. I expected that of myself. And how all of this felt in line with exactly what we've been talking about throughout this entire video. I'm gonna be honest. This whole situation has been really scary for me, and I'm not trying to garner sympathy from you by saying that. I'm just trying to explain how I feel emotionally and have felt emotionally for the past few days about this. How I really, really, really want this to be a chance for me to learn and move forward, and how I'm trying to do my best to not hurt anyone and to try and do the best thing that I can in this situation. But there's a lot to feel and sift through and reconcile as one human being, especially when I consider that this platform is my financial stability. And also what's saddened me most about this is that there were legit criticisms of me, things that I want to listen to and take into account, most specifically from people in communities that I'm not a part of, but that it was hard to see them immediately amidst the heightened emotion and contradictory inputs and valid and disparate opinions from people within these same communities that I was seeing, and also the fact that I had to find all of those within overall hyperbolicized and angering discourse that I had to read every single part of, and that frightened me to read and as I was trying to find these valid criticisms. This video has focused on folks like Whedon and Rowling, who are big creators with huge followings and platforms who did and are perpetuating clear lines of harm and are mostly insulated from it. But what about on this level, the same level that I and those in my similar field work in, where we have this direct one-to-one with our audience? Everything felt overwhelming, but I wanted to listen. I needed to listen. The onus is on me to do so. And quite thankfully, amidst everything, I did find people who were challenging me and confronting me. These were the voices I wished to hear and centralize. These are the conversations needed to not be sifted through to find amidst everything else, but to be the predominant narrative, to create the conversation. Sadly, this is rarely the case. Yet there were many of you who were in my comments talking to me about this, and I deeply appreciated it, who confronted me not to attack, but to challenge my words honestly. There were quite a few of you, and like I said, I tried to listen and, internalize and think about every single one of them. But there is one that I wish to read part of here, as I think it pertains to this discussion, and one which really stuck with me and has made me think since I read it. It's also interesting that you acknowledge that this creator has caused harm to communities of color, and based on screenshots that I'm seeing, this isn't the first time, but go on to proclaim how this creator has been so great to you. Both of those things can be true, and you don't have to lie about their character, but the way you presented this whole thing seems very, I know this creator hurt you, but aside from this tweet, they've been great to me. And the problem is, there's no room for but. I learned that from black trans women. When someone is transphobic, it doesn't matter how great they are in other respects or how nice they are to me. As a cis person, I need to stop supporting them as long as they espouse transphobic views and until they earnestly make amends. So why does she get to keep harming communities of color with no restitution and have your support? Now, this tweet really confronted me in a way that made me think quite a lot. I didn't know specific accusations about this creator from communities of color before my statement. Issues that I should have been aware of and now am. So I'm not using that as an excuse like, oh, I didn't know this. These were things that I should have been aware of. And while this creator has apologized for these comments, the criticism that this person in these comments is saying is entirely fair and important for me to hear. Because it led me to think, had I done, as I had done with J.K. Rowling before, missed things until it affected me? Had I not done enough of the work that I should have? Quite possibly. This comment honestly has caused me to wrestle with my own thoughts the past few days. It's shown me that even when I make videos like the one that I'm making right now, I can still make the same mistakes and be blinded the same ways, to miss things that I should have been more aware of, even as I try to talk about that very thing. So how do I deal with the fact that I have now worked with and am friendly with a person who I know is trying, but has failed? And who still has a platform after this, regardless of if I continue to interact with it or not? How I wish to give them a chance to grow, but know that there are things that they have done that are not my place to forgive. And how do I handle the fact that some from communities not my own will not forgive? And they have every right to do so. While conversely, some, as I've seen, are willing to give them that chance. How do I reconcile that? Even further, looking at the criticisms against their past, which they did apologize for, but some people in communities of color have accepted and some have not, well, that's something I need to confront. Nor do I wish to be praised or congratulated for how nuanced I am for giving them that chance at forgiveness, while others' concerns are sometimes not discussed and centralized. And so I'm left in the gray, trying to hold all these things, and it's paralyzing. I want to try to do what I can to give this person a chance to grow, but I also don't wish to do so at the expense of people who have understandable concerns. And I have to do this all the while battling and navigating the more hyperbolic framings of the discussion that this person's the worst or that they're the best, and I'm the worst or the best for having my stance that I have. I want deeply to do what's best. That's what my heart keeps telling me to do, but I need to realize there is no best. There is just choice. And there is just me needing to recognize and think about and try to find who I need to centralize and think about in these discussions. All I know is I don't wish to choose something that comes at the expense of those more marginalized than myself or from communities that are not mine. But even that is not exactly clear cut either. I wish I had a definitive statement here to make, but I don't. There's a part of me that's scared to share this segment of this video. But I also feel to not to would be doing a disservice to the message of this video, of wrestling with the in-between rather than allowing ourselves the easy choice of saying thing is inherently good or thing is inherently bad. And it would be a betrayal to my own promise to myself to constantly be self-critical and to be honest and to recognize that I deserve nothing and therefore need to be responsible with what I do have, with the platform that I have been given. So I don't have an answer. It's messy, and I wish I knew what the exact right thing to do is, but there isn't one. All I can do is try to learn and go forward. However, I will say this situation has definitively taught me a few things. First and foremost, I need to be just as harsh on my friends as those who I don't know. As a certain writer once wrote, it takes a great deal of bravery to stand up to our enemies, but just as much to stand up to our friends. It's kind of ironic who wrote that, if you know who wrote that. But I hope I have made clear that I don't really view anyone as my enemy. And as for friends, in this case, it means just those who are in my professional space, not necessarily close friends. But it showcases how this nuance cuts both ways. It means not just being nuanced in the negative, but in the positive too. So from now on, I'm going to be more critical of not only this creator, but other creators I work with and myself. I promise that as best that I can promise that.
Even further, I reached out to a few folks from the trans, black, and trans women of color communities on this matter, and I'm going to work to do better retroactively and more importantly, proactively to anything I hope to discuss in future, both with these issues and elsewhere. Because I think it's important not to tokenize marginalized folks to only be able to talk about issues when it relates to them specifically in their identity. I, as a trans person who is often only asked to be on podcasts or consulted with on trans issues because I'm trans, instead of a broad range of things I like, I know what that feels like. How, for example, I love Star Trek in numerous different ways, yet I'm sometimes only asked to be on Trek podcasts or channels for their LGBTQ episodes, which I love to do, but I'm more than a Trekkie for just its gay stuff. Even further, when things like this come up again, I'm going to make sure I'm taking extra care to center those who are hurt. And while I, as a trans person who was hurt by this person's words, can be considered among those who were harmed by this, I don't wish to minimize the issues as they pertain to others both in my, other, and intersecting communities.
This situation has also reinforced something that I have been constantly trying to be better about. I've been trying to make a concerted effort to include voices in my videos from communities and from identities that are not my own. I hope you've seen that in videos like my Sex and Star Trek video. Yet, I still need to do better about seeking out and platforming folks and listening to folks as best I can from communities outside of my white, trans, and femme perspective, and vet them as best I can with my limited time and resources. To give the platform to those who typically don't get one, and who have proven not to have this baggage that some other creators have, but do have good intent and desire and ability that they either already have or wish to foster. And I'm going to work harder at doing that. And that's not something, by the way, that I should be celebrated for. It should be the expectation of all creators, especially white creators like myself. If we want to use our platform responsibly and to work and build coalitions of communities in this space, this needs to be the expectation. We need to center voices from communities who have repeatedly not been centered, not only in society in general, but in this YouTube space that we find ourselves in. That needs to be the standard, not the exception or the venerated. And more than anything, I want all of you to hold me accountable to that. Even further, while I hope I have done my best to be both critical and nuanced of anyone regardless of race or identity, I need to make sure I'm self-assessing when I give white creators grace, and be sure I'm not doing so at the expense of those of other backgrounds, and also be sure that I'm prepared to give that same grace to creators of color. I feel like I have strived to do that, but it's also not for me to make that evaluation. Finally, the last thing I'm reaffirming to myself is that I need to actively listen to ongoing conversations, especially as they pertain to communities I am not a part of, especially about situations I'm even tangentially involved in. And as we've been speaking about in this entire video, work to try to centralize those conversations rather than the hyperbolic discourse. Something that I've always tried to do on this channel, but obviously I've not always been perfect at. And as for the rest, well, for that, I really want to hear your thoughts about it. As I said before, this is a conversation, and I am, as always, open to your criticisms and comments. I read every comment, email, and DM I receive, and while I can't respond to every single one of them, I try my best to as I can, though I only have so much time. And I hope you all know that I'm trying my best to struggle with what it means to have this platform and be responsible with it, and that I want to do good with it for not just myself, but others who are like and who are not like me. And you don't owe me a damned thing either way. And if I fuck up in a way that you don't like, and you want to criticize me or get angry at me or stop watching me, I get it. All I ask is that you know I'm trying, and that's my intention. Also, quite literally as I'm filming this, I've had a little bit of sudden self-awareness. Considering the fact that you just watched me have an existential crisis on camera, I'd actually recommend FD Signifier's excellent video on this very topic, about white people having existential crises on camera about issues like this.
Also, editing Jessie here, because there was one last thing that I realized that I wanted to make very clear as I was editing this. None of this is meant as a defense of me or my thoughts. I'm putting them out in this video not to defend myself, but to try and be open and vulnerable about this process that I'm going through, because I think it's illuminating to the messiness that I've been discussing this whole video. I honestly expect many of you to wholeheartedly agree with everything that I've said and to relate 100%, and then I also expect many of you to be angry or disagree with every single thing that I've said and actually objectively be really upset by what I've said. And I know most of you will probably fall in somewhere between those two extremes. And I'm not here to tell any of you which way to fall. I'm just telling you where I'm at, because I think that maybe in my own self-indulgent way, valuable to what we've been talking about today. But I don't expect anyone, whether you disagree with me or are hurt by my words or find them harmful, or even if you love everything that I've said, to owe me anything. If you do wish to share your hurt or your thoughts or criticisms or your, agreements with me, I honestly and openly wish to hear it. I appreciate that in any way that you do, as long as it's coming from a place of trying to be constructive. But you don't owe me that either. What I want, though, is to have conversations, but I want those conversations to be constructive. And if I can't do that for you, I understand. But I also wish to say that all of this is really hard, especially as a creator in this space. I can't speak for other creators specifically, but after Lindsay Ellis's letter came out, I actually spoke to a lot of my peers in this content creator space, especially on YouTube. And I found that many of them were distraught and honestly very scared by Lindsay's words. Because in many ways, what happened to her is something that many of us live in
fear of in this space. You know, I and I know many of my fellow creators want to be held accountable if we screw up, if we cause harm or anything like that. We want to listen to that. But we also see this kind of storm around us. You know, there are people that really love us, and there are people that really, really hate us, especially when we talk about these very sensitive issues. And there are folks even beyond that who I see in websites specifically devoted to harassing trans people or people from marginalized groups who talk about me and other creators in really disgusting, nasty ways. And they're always there ready to stoke any resentment or perceived wrongdoing. I mean, this is something that Lindsay Ellis herself spoke about, too, when she was sort of, you know, still a content creator in this space, how she was aware of that and how she'd been harassed by, honestly, just Nazis. But also that they would be willing to take advantage of honest conversations, too, and stoke that. But how in those situations, a lot of us creators are trying to do the right thing, but are sometimes trying to figure that out at the same time, while people are expecting us to get it right immediately. And in many ways, people have a right to expect that given our platform and amount of people that pay attention to us. But it's also on a platform like this YouTube that rewards drama and antagonism between creators and all this stuff, and it rewards that with views and money. And how on top of that also, how our financial well-being is also resting on our perceived virtue, but how everyone's perception of our virtue and their own virtues and things like that is all different in different circumstances. And how I know also that 99% of you out there listening to me saying this probably understand most, if not all, of what I'm saying and are ready and willing to engage in the nuance, because I'm lucky and many other content creators that I, talk to are lucky to have created that space. But how sometimes there are the 1% of people who take things too far and forget our humanity, or how we all sometimes forget the humanity of content creators that we watch because we don't expect them to see the things that we are saying, or don't expect them to be online or ever to engage with us, but how many creators do see that stuff. And how within all of that, I and my fellow creators look at Lindsay Ellis's letter, which was so open about the trauma that she faced and now suffers from daily, regardless of whatever success she's had financially or whatever. We see that part of it. We see the pain that she now lives with because of being in this space and all that stuff, and how that's terrifying. It's scary, especially as a trans creator like myself, or for creators from other marginalized communities too, who again are held to higher criticism and have people ready to, wield transphobia or other bigotries against us while there are actual legitimate criticisms going on. But at the end of the day, I also know that this is the field that I choose to work in, and I want to use this platform and opportunity that I have to try my best to help others and fight for the marginalized, while also hopefully having a little bit of fun too in there and give fun and happiness to other people and do good for others. I guess I just wish that this antagonism that this world constantly tries to stoke today, the society constantly tries to stoke today, wasn't like this, because it doesn't have to be like this. So, to finalize out this way over long video, I want to make some things very clear. You see, while I haven't said it, what I've been talking about this entire video is cancel culture. How we prop people up as heroes and then cut them down as villains in a very binarized, antagonistic way. But that cancel culture narrative is just a right-wing reactionary narrative that we should not play into, because this binarized discourse just refuses to allow us to have nuanced discussions, to move forward. It turns anyone critiquing these figures into being malicious figures, into bad actors. And then we can't actually talk about what's happening, about what actually is going on and what we need to do to reform it. It individualizes it and binarizes it. And it's also so incredibly cynical because it frames everyone who disagrees with you as malicious and out to get you. It frames everyone in your life as possibly ready to just turn on you and attack you and destroy you at any singular moment. A very dark view of the world. And I don't believe the world is that dark. If we just see art as inherently good or bad and people as inherently good or bad, it refuses to allow us to reconcile with the truth. I don't believe in good or bad people. It would be so easy to dehumanize people like Joss Whedon or J.K. Rowling, or conversely, to dehumanize their critics. But we shouldn't and can't allow cancel culture to do that to us. It allows abusers to remove themselves from responsibilities for their actions and for abuse to continue to be perpetuated in the name of virtue. We need to recognize that all things human are complex, contradictory, and constantly in the gray. I recently did a video on Gene Roddenberry, the first in my Sex and Star Trek series. Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, was also a deified man and creator. A man who started to believe in his own godhood, his unflappability, and perpetuated harm because of it. Yet at the same time, he made Star Trek, a franchise that has deeply inspired me to this day. I mean, shit, look at my shelf and look at the tattoos on my arms. But the role of that video that I made about him was to look at this question of how the views, faults, and foibles of a singular man got amplified, reflected, pushed back against, and ultimately defined all the people who touched the work that came after him, both as fans of the work or people who worked on it directly. All because the myth of the man became equated with the man himself, forgetting the man's humanity in the process. Humanity here defined as deeply flawed and yet also capable of great good. Neither hero nor villain, god or demon, just human. And recognizing that the work he made is both linked to and reflective of his faults and mistakes as a human, but also of his hopes and dreams and successes. So too with Whedon and Rowling. They are both people who have done, and in some cases are still doing, deep harm. And yet, just seeing them in these binarized terms denies us the ability to address the truth beneath it all, that they made works of art that helped many, that inspired many, that mean so much. And yet their work is also ingrained with numerous problems too. We don't need to defend it or condemn it. What we need to do is learn from it. And learning from it means to learn from the good and the bad. And so too with human beings. If we only see the perfection or faults of a person, we deny ourselves the chance to address and learn from the harm that was done, and deny them the chance to learn from it too. Further, it allows them to not be held accountable. While Whedon and Rowling both have faced some harm and harassment, which is bad, they do get to live out their lives in a mansion in Whedon's case, and in Rowling she gets to make more movies, sell more stuff. And while Whedon has faced some accountability through his tarnished career, which he absolutely deserves, Rowling, for the most part, still has not. But even more so, this canceling narrative, a binarized view of the world, only really serves to perpetuate harm against the most marginalized and keeps those in power with power. Those who are directly harmed and those who speak out for them get harassed. Those whose communities are misrepresented are cast as villains and antagonists, justifying further harm against those communities, both in these situations and elsewhere in more heightened arenas like politics. And for my own self, those who try to have a nuanced discourse on this matter are constantly forced to identify and defend those who harm us and who never see our own humanity, and also constantly have to disavow those in our own community who are understandably upset and hurt, but sometimes misguidedly lashing out. And even then, we still receive harassment, despite our best efforts, because we're seen as just the villains. So, here is what I leave you with. There are no gods or demons. A work of art can be both inspiration and flawed because it is human. And to be human is to be both. Wrestle with that. Deal with it. Live in the gray. I do that every day in my gender. So I'm sure as hell you can do it with your fiction and your relation to other people. We all live in the gray every day as humans, despite our needs to put everything into neat little boxes. Not everything needs to be, in fact, nothing is perfect or evil. People are not gods or saints, nor demons or devils. They are humans. I'm not saying that to excuse harm, but to point out that harm comes from human places, not mystical ones. And I think what we need more of is to recognize that simple fact. Because until we do, we cannot move forward together. All right, everyone, I am back in the fun Professor Sexy vest. At least I hope it is. I just want to say thank you to everyone who watched this entire video. I know this one was on a harder topic. It was definitely hard for me to do this on multiple different levels, and I appreciate you all for listening. And I want to say and repeat again that I welcome the conversation and the criticism with everything that I've said here. But with that said, I do have a little bit of housekeeping to do, but if you stick around for a few more minutes, I've also got a cool announcement that I teased at the beginning of this video about a new podcast project that I'm pretty sure many of you will be excited about. And I also got some bloopers of me in that statue makeup from the start of the video, so there's that to look forward to, so hang with me for just a little bit longer. But housekeeping first. First off, don't forget to like and subscribe because, you know, YouTube likes that stuff. It really does help me out. And also with all of that, again, I am desiring the conversation on this video, and I am planning to read every single comment as best I can. But I also know that many people may not feel comfortable having their comments out publicly because this is a very sensitive topic. So I want to reiterate that my DMs on Twitter and my email are open. They're linked below if you do want to reach out to me there. I can't promise that I'm going to respond to everything because I'm just a single human being. But again, I will read every single thing. I want to hear criticism, critique, thoughts on everything that was said here, positive, negative, or in between. I am open to it. I want to hear it. All I ask is just basic kindness in those emails, because I do read them. I have gotten some nasty stuff, not for this, for other things, just that are dumber than this actual serious topic. But just as long as you're treating me with respect, I promise to hear every single thought that you've said. The last piece of housekeeping here is all of this is possible not only because of Nebula, Curiosity, and all that stuff, but because of my patrons. You do get thanked at the end of the video, but I also wish to add an extra special thank you here. Patrons, thank you. I adore you. Thank you for your support and everything that I do, and I send you all my love and appreciate you for everything that you've done. So, mwah, to all of you, my friends. But with that said, finally, let's get into the fun stuff, the announcement, and all of that. Yes, the announcement that I'm making is that I'm doing a podcast called Vest about all the sex... No, I'm not going to do a podcast about Vest, unless you want that, in which case I totally will. But the announcement actually is that for about 2 years now, my friend Vera Wild from the YouTube channel Council of Geeks and I have been doing a podcast called What the Frell, where we rewatched every episode of Farscape, a show that I had not watched, but she was doing a rewatch of. But we finally are about to hit the end of that show. But she and I love doing this podcast together, and so we decided to keep the podcast going with a new show, and it's a show that many of you I know have been asking me to cover for quite a while, and that is Babylon 5. So I'm very excited to announce that a new podcast called Jumpgate, which will be on the same feed as What the Frell, so if you're already subscribed to the podcast, it will be the same exact feed. You don't need to change anything. If you're not on that feed, it will be linked below. But again, the podcast is called Jumpgate. We're going to go through every single episode of Farscape, including the movies, the spin-off stuff, all that fun stuff. It's going to be a really fun time. As the time I'm recording this, I believe the first episode will be going up in about a week because we still have to finish out What the Frell with 1 or 2 more episodes at the time of this recording. But within a week or two, if you subscribe to that What the Frell podcast feed, you will find the Jumpgate podcast. So I'm excited to begin that journey with all of you and rewatch a show that I have not seen in forever and really adore and share it with one of my very best friends who has not seen it herself. But that is all the fun stuff. That is the announcement. I'm excited for all of it. Thank you again for this topic, and I'm going to wind out this already overly long video, so enjoy the bloopers that I'm about to share with you, and with that, I bid you all a live long and prosper. Don't blink. Blink, and you're dead. Sorry, I had to do it. I'm in this makeup. I had to. I just had to. Jessie's gonna make her own Marvel cinematic universe. Get it? Marvel? Because Marvel and Marvel, it's a pun. You know what? I'm funny, damn it. Has to do with statues, but it's what I'm gonna do right here. I just want to do something weird in makeup. I don't know why anyone listens to me, 'cause I'm a weird dork that's in a room by herself, singing in statue makeup. What you gonna do about it? I get paid to do this 'cause my life is strange and I don't know why anyone pays attention to me. I guess I'm just a weirdo with makeup and I'll take it. Ha 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 ha. This is a light bulb, it's not a microphone, but I'm singing to it as if it was. I can say sentence is good now. Don't you like it that I write scripts good? Now I gotta go get naked and take a very long shower to get all this makeup off. So that's my day for the rest of the day. Have fun. Thank you so much to all my patrons who make this possible. I could not do this without you. I really appreciate you, and you help pay my bills. You help me be able to do these types of videos, and it really means a lot to have all of you here. So a thank you to every single one of my patrons, but an extra special patron rap thank you to Morgan the Pirate Queen, Joe Herman Holt, Miranda Janelle, Elizabeth Tivy, DJ Samuels, Catherine Lambeth, Ashley Allen, Bo Kikio, Lily Gray, Stephen Kleinard, Jem Shin, Mary Mello, Ellie Gobert, Ish the Mad, Matt Chung, Andrew Yoha, Super Desi, Randy Thompson, Wellington Marcus, DKS Ray, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl, Vincent Ellington, Chloe Dollar, G-Man 42, Joseph Dewey, Felicia Toast, Alex Miller, Sylvester Rattow, Elizabeth Christensen, Dominic Noble, James Krivda, Barbara Ruski, Jennifer Huss, Zone 1 Librarian, Jessica Wright, Sun Corgi, Nathaniel Fraughton, Sonia Naranjo Perdeau, Peter Landers, Jared Johnson, Far Engato, Geek Filter, Mountain Harpy, Celestial Dawn, Louietha Boyd, Wen Dizzle Bizzle, Shasha M, Pissed and Twisted Garage, Stephen Richardson, John Weatherby, Melinda Walter, Julissa the Pagan, Meta Whisperer, WN Edie, Cyber Quaker, Kevin Freitag, Beatrix Perfects, Alex Owen, Tiffany Danger, Bass, All the Tribbles Sing, Casual Observer, Maggie the Goblin, Gretchen Badger, Lamia, Lysa, Odd Just Odd, Sarah Leslie Hutchkins, 'Cause I've got faith of the heart, Flynn, Sarah Bystem, Sarah Lemero, William Stewart, Jessica Chapman, Jess Johnson, Kay Liss, Verdos Kai, Hioresis, Noble Monster Comics, Blue Sky Skinner, Troy Stahl, Jason Knott, Melody Ann Winters Good, Jacob Tovar, Nathan Steele, Laura Devereaux, Maeve, Andrew K, Spooky Heather Sylvia, Sean Piper, Moon Near Amlani, Strawberry Pup Tart, Polly Mina, Nikki Gordon Bloomfield, Crit Fax, Emily Loomis, Jenny Marble, Michael Godey, Pasty, Elijah M, Ver, Andy H, Corey and Vale, Honkinen. Love you all, my dears. Mwah.